The rift did not open with thunder. It opened the way a wound opens, quietly, and then all at once, a hairline seam of violet-black light stitching itself across the sky above the eaves of Ithilien, no wider than a blade's edge at first, silent but for a sound none of the watching trees had words for. Not wind, not fire, but a low, resonant hum, like the inside of a bell struck once and never allowed to stop ringing. Mablung felt it before he saw it, a pressure behind the eyes, a wrongness in the marrow, the way a man feels a storm coming before the first cloud shows itself over the white mountains. He had walked these woods for 30 years, had felt the cold that crept out of Minas Morgul on ill winds, and the deeper cold that lived under the black gate of Mordor itself, and this was neither of those. This was something that did not belong to the world at all, not shadow, not flame, not any hue of magic he had ever been taught to fear. He caught Damrod's eye across the clearing. The younger ranger had already gone still, one hand drifting to the hilt of the long dagger across his chest, his gaze fixed on the sky through the black lattice of branches. "Do you feel that?" Damrod said, low. "I feel it," Mablung answered. They had been 3 days out from the hidden refuge at Henneth Anun, tracking a band of Sauron scouts who had strayed too far north, along the Anduin's eastern banks. Routine work, the kind of patrol that filled the empty months between the war's louder cruelties. Faramir led them himself, as he often did when the woods felt uneasy, trusting his own eyes over any report brought back second-hand. He had gone ahead along the ridge with 2 others to scout the ravine below. Mablung and Damrod and 4 more had held the tree line, watching the darkening gorge for any glint of Sauron steel. They had found no Southrons that evening. They found the sky tearing open instead. The seam widened. What had been a hairline crack became a wound the width of a man's outstretched arms, then wider still, and the light spilling from it was not any color the eye wanted to hold. A violet so deep it read as black in the corners, shot through with threads of pale, cold blue that moved like something alive beneath still water. The trees beneath it did not burn. They bent. Every branch within 100 paces leaned inward toward the tier, as though the world itself had begun, very slowly, to fall into it. "Get down," Mablung said, and did not wait to see if the others obeyed before he was flat against the cold earth himself, one hand dragging Damrod down beside him. The hum became a sound with weight. It pressed against the chest like a hand laid flat over the heart. Somewhere above them a nightjar screamed once and went silent, and every small creature in the wood, the voles, the foxes, even the ever-present midges that had plagued them for 3 days, simply stopped. The forest went still in the particular, total way that meant something had walked into it that did not belong to any order the wood understood. Then, with a sound like a struck bell finally allowed to fade, the tier closed. It did not vanish gently. It collapsed inward on itself in a single violent instant, and the light it had been bleeding into the sky snapped back through the seam like water swallowed down a drain, and in the half-second before it sealed entirely, something came through with it. Not falling, not thrown. It came through the way a blade comes through a curtain, fast, controlled, already in motion before it had fully arrived, and struck the floor of the ravine below with a concussion that Mablung felt through the ground itself, a single sharp impact, and then nothing, silence. The kind of silence that made a man's own breathing sound like a betrayal. For a long moment none of them moved. Mablung lay pressed against the cold earth with his heart slamming against his ribs, and made himself count breaths, count heartbeats, the old discipline that had kept him alive through 30 years of an unquiet wood, until the shaking in his hands stilled enough to trust them on his bow. "Captain will have seen that," Damrod breathed, and even his voice, usually so quick to steel itself, carried an unfamiliar thinness. "He'll have seen more than we did," Mablung said. "He was closer." They came up from the ground slowly, bows in hand, though neither had an arrow nocked, some deeper instinct telling them that whatever answer waited in that ravine would not be found by shooting blind into the dark. Mablung raised a hand and signaled the other four to hold the tree line, a silent order, decades of habit distilled into a single gesture, and moved forward with Damrod at his shoulder, down the slope toward the place where the light had struck. The ravine floor was scorched in a rough circle perhaps 10 paces across. The frost-hardened earth and dead bracken burned back to bare stone in a pattern that radiated outward from a central point, like the spokes of some vast broken wheel. At the center of it, where by any reason there should have been a smoking crater, a fallen star, a corpse, there was nothing at all. No blood, no wreckage, only a faint shimmer still hanging in the cold air, like heat rising off summer stone, already fading as they watched. "There's nothing here," Damrod said, and Mablung heard the question underneath it. "Then what did we feel? What did we see fall?" And had no answer to give him. They searched the scorched circle in the fading light, moving with the careful, silent economy of men who had learned long ago not to trust an empty clearing simply because it looked empty. It was Mablung who found the marks in the ash at the circle's northern edge, a set of footprints, deep and precise, booted but strangely narrow, the stride between them longer than any man's gait should allow, cutting a straight, unbroken line out of the scorched circle and into the deeper trees beyond. He crouched over the nearest print and laid 2 fingers against its edge. The ash there was still faintly warm. "Whatever fell here," he said quietly, "did not lie stunned for long." Above them on the ridge, Faramir had seen it all, the tear opening like a second, wounded sky, the violent collapse, the single point of impact in the ravine below, and had held his own 2 rangers still beside him with a raised hand, watching, weighing, the way he weighed everything before he moved. He was a man who had learned patience from a father who had none left to spare him, and grief had taught him, better than any drill master could, the cost of acting before understanding. "Captain," one of his rangers murmured, "should we go down?" "Not yet." Faramir's eyes did not leave the ravine. Whatever that was, it did not come from Mordor, and it did not come from the enemy's craft that I have ever seen or heard tell of. That does not make it a friend. He watched the last threads of violet light fade from the sky like a bruise healing in reverse. "Send word to Mablung to track it, not engage it. I want to know what walks in Ithilien tonight, before I decide whether it is a threat to be met with steel, or a wonder to be left alone." Half a league north, in the deepening dark beneath the eaves of the wood, the thing that had fallen through the tier was already moving, and moving, for the first time since the rift had swallowed it whole, with something that was not quite panic and not quite calm, but the narrow, focused space between them that a soldier learns to live inside when the mission has already gone wrong and there is no one left to call for extraction. Inside the frame, in the small dark chamber behind the armor's chest plate, where the true self rode hidden and small, the operator was screaming. Not aloud. There was no aloud anymore, only the raw static of transference torn sideways through something the void itself had never mapped, and had been screaming, in some fashion, since the moment the tear had closed around them mid-jump and thrown them somewhere the Lotus's voice could not follow. "Ordis. Ordis, are you there? Ordis?" Nothing answered. No familiar half-broken cadence crackling faithfully back through the link. No ship systems chiming confirmation. No soft telemetry scrolling reassuringly across the inside of the operator's vision the way it always had. Every jump, every extraction, every single time since the second dream had taught them what they truly were. There was only silence where a voice should be, and beneath that silence, worse than it, an absence. The specific, bottomless absence of a connection that has not merely gone quiet, but has been severed at the root, the void itself unreachable, the origin system no longer answering to any signal the frame could throw at it. The Warframe's body did not share the operator's panic. Not directly. Excalibur's systems ran on older, colder instincts, ones built for exactly this: unknown terrain, no extraction, hostiles unconfirmed. The frame rose from its crouch in the burned clearing with the fluid, unhurried economy of a machine built by dead gods for a war that had lasted 10,000 years. Energy lines along its limbs flaring faint cyan in the gathering dark, and began, methodically, to do what it had always done when the mission broke: assess. No hostile contacts, no comm signal, friendly or otherwise, on any frequency it could parse. Atmosphere breathable, barely worth confirming, but confirmed all the same. Local biosphere, organic, old-growth forest, temperate, no trace of the fungal blight or infested corruption that would have painted every tree in warning colors across the frame's overlay. No wreckage, no orbiter, no sign, anywhere, of the ship that should have been holding position exactly where the jump had begun. Somewhere is wrong, the frame registered, in the flat non-language of its own processes, and passed the assessment inward to the small trembling consciousness that piloted it, the way it had been built, 10,000 years ago, to serve. The operator, inside, finally stopped screaming long enough to listen. Where? Not a question anyone answered. Just the shape of it, turning over and over in the dark behind the frame's borrowed eyes. Where am I? Where is the ship? Where is she? The forest gave no answer either, only cold and dark, and the particular, ancient quiet of trees that had never once heard the word Tenno, and did not know yet what had just walked into them. They moved. There was nothing else to do. A soldier does not sit still in unmapped territory waiting for the dark to explain itself. A soldier moves until the terrain gives up its shape, and the frame's long, silent strides ate the distance through the black trees with the eerie, gliding precision of something built for exactly this kind of hunting stillness. Parkour instincts translating without thought into a careful, near-silent lope over root and stone. Energy already gathering faint and low along the blade at its hip, in case the dark chose, at any moment, to become a threat instead of merely strange. It was Damrod who saw it first, a flicker of pale motion between two black trunks 100 paces distant, gone again before his eye could fully close around the shape of it, moving with a speed and a silence that no living creature he knew of Ithilien's woods could have managed. He froze mid-step, one hand rising in the old silent signal. Contact, and Mablung was at his shoulder in an instant, both of them going still as stone in the deeper shadow of an old oak's roots. There, Damrod breathed, barely more than shaped air. White, moving fast, too fast. Mablung, nothing runs like that. Mablung's eyes found it a heartbeat later. A pale shape crossing a thin gap of moonlight 40 paces off, there and gone in less time than it took to blink. And even in that fractured half-second, his eye caught something that made the hair rise along his arms. The shape had been armored, sleek and inhuman in its proportions, and where its face should have been there had been only a thin vertical line of cold blue light. Neither man spoke for several long breaths. Not Southron, Damrod said finally. No, not orc kind either. Nothing out of Mordor moves like that. Nothing out of Mordor moves silent. Mablung did not answer at once. He was thinking of Faramir's words on the ridge. Track it, not engage it. And of 30 years spent learning the difference between a thing that could be reasoned with and a thing that could only be survived. And finding, for the first time in a long while, that he did not yet know which of the two had just crossed their path in the dark. We follow, he said at last. At distance. We do not loose an arrow at a shadow we don't understand. Not yet. Faramir will want a full account before anyone spills blood tonight, ours or its. They moved out from the oak's shadow together, bows low, breath held, following a trail that led deeper into Ithilien's darkening heart. A trail left by something that did not know it was being followed, and would not, for some time yet, care that it was. Above them, the last scar of violet light finally faded from the night sky, leaving only stars, and cold, and the long, listening silence of a wood that had just felt the first tremor of a storm it had no name for. A storm that would not break tonight, nor tomorrow, but was already, quietly, beginning to gather. The trail led north and east, deeper into the tangled dark beneath Ithilien's canopy, and it took Mablung the better part of an hour to understand what unsettled him most about it. Not the strangeness of the stride, though that unsettled him plenty, but the precision of it. No hunter, no soldier, no creature of the wild moved with a gait so evenly spaced, so utterly without hesitation, weaving between root and stone and fallen branch, as if the ground itself had been mapped and memorized long before the foot ever touched it. It doesn't stumble, Damrod murmured once, crouched beside a print pressed clean into the soft loam beneath an old beech. Not once, not even where the ground's soft. No, Mablung agreed. He had tracked wolves and wardens, and once, memorably, a young and reckless Boromir through these same woods, and none of them had left a trail like this. A trail that read less like a living thing moving through unfamiliar terrain, and more like a blade drawn cleanly through cloth. Whatever it is, it does not fear this wood. That troubles me more than if it fled from us. They pressed on. The moon had climbed high enough now to lay pale bars of light across the forest floor, and twice more they caught the pale shape moving between the trees ahead of them. Never close, never lingering, always gone again before either man could bring a bow fully to bear. It did not seem, Mablung thought, to be fleeing them exactly. It moved with purpose, not panic, casting wide loops through the trees, as if it were searching for something rather than running from someone, and every so often it would go utterly, unnervingly still for the space of several breaths, a pale shape, frozen between two trunks like a hound, testing the wind, before moving on again. It is listening for something, Mablung thought, and found the thought did not comfort him at all, and it has not yet found it. He did not know that he was, in that moment, more right than he understood. Inside the frame's narrow chest, the operator had stopped screaming somewhere in the second hour, and settled instead into the colder, more useful territory of raw calculation, the kind of focus born from realizing, fully and finally, that no one was coming, and that survival now rested entirely on hands that were not, technically, hands at all. No comm, no void signature I can read, no relay, no beacon, no orbiter transponder, nothing. The thought looped, worn smooth with repetition. This isn't a jump gone wrong. This is somewhere the void doesn't reach at all. That thought frightened the operator more than the silence itself. The void had always been there, vast and cold and half alive, the deep current that ran under and through everything a Tenno was, the thing that had made them what they were, and never, not once in all the missions and all the systems and all the strange corners of the origin system, had it simply stopped, been absent, as if some vast route the operator hadn't known they were standing on had, without warning, been cut away beneath their feet, leaving only the frame's own systems, self-contained and finite, to keep them alive in whatever this place was. Focus, the operator told themselves, in the flat internal voice they'd learned, over years, to use on the parts of their mind that wanted to spiral. No ship, no signal. That means self-sufficient protocol. Find shelter, find a defensible position, find out what's actually out here before anything decides to find you first. The frame moved on that directive without further prompting. Excalibur's base instincts, and the operator's will threading together into the single seamless motion that transference had always promised, and only rarely, in the frame's long service, actually delivered this cleanly. It was, perhaps, the only mercy of the whole catastrophe. Whatever this world was, whatever had swallowed the rift and severed the void, the bond between operator and frame had held. They were not alone, they were only lost. It was the smell that changed things. Some 3 hours into the pursuit, a smell the frame's sensors flagged before the operator's own nose, riding second-hand through borrowed perception, fully registered it. Old blood, tanned leather, and beneath both, the acrid mineral tang the operator's mind, still cataloging everything in the only language it had, filed under unrefined weapons-grade metal, recently forged. Organic hostiles, close. The frame went still in the shadow of a fallen log, energy along its limbs dimming to nothing, every system dropping into the deep, patient quiet of a hunter that has decided, for now, to be prey instead. 40 paces east, moving in a loose, careless line through the trees with none of the caution the rangers had shown, came a band of Sauron scouts. The very patrol Faramir's company had been tracking for 3 days before the sky itself had interrupted the hunt. 9 of them, dark-cloaked, curved blades at their hips, moving with the loud confidence of men who did not expect to be found so deep inside what they still, wrongly, believed to be empty country. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a red sash knotted at his shoulder, marking him as blooded in some southern warband's ranks, walked at the front with a torch held low, throwing long orange light across the black trunks and, for one unguarded moment, across the fallen log behind which the frame crouched utterly still. Mablung, watching from a rise 30 paces further back, felt his stomach drop. "They're walking right into it," Damrod whispered, and there was something almost like sympathy in his voice, misplaced as it was. "Whatever that thing is, it's right there. It's going to—" He did not finish the thought, because in the next instant, everything happened at once. One of the Sauron scouts, younger than the rest, quicker-eyed, caught a flash of pale light off the fallen log's far side, and shouted a warning, already reaching for his blade, and the frame was moving before the shout had finished leaving his throat. Mablung had seen fast men before. He had watched Boromir spar in the yards of Minas Tirith, had seen elven scouts move through Lothlorien's eaves with a grace that seemed to bend the world's rules around them, and had believed, until this exact moment, that he understood the outer edge of what speed could look like on a living frame. He had been wrong. The Warframe crossed the 40 paces between Log and Sauron line in less time than it took Mablung to draw a full breath, a pale blur low to the ground, and the energy blade that had been dormant at its hip flared into being mid-stride. Not steel, not any forged metal Mablung's eye had a name for, but a curved edge of solid, humming light the color of a winter sky just before dawn, and it met the first drawn Sauron scimitar, not with a clash of metal on metal, but with a sound like a struck tuning fork, high and clean, and the scimitar simply parted, not shattered. Parted, cleanly, the way silk parts under a hot blade, the severed half spinning away into the dark, while its owner still stood there, uncomprehending. For the half-second it took the frame to put him down without killing him. A precise strike to the shoulder joint, the flat of the blade rather than the edge, that dropped the man screaming and clutching a dislocated arm, rather than a mortal wound. Non-lethal, the operator noted, somewhere in the calm, cold center of themself, even as the rest of the encounter unfolded in the strange, compressed time that combat always seemed to move through. Good instinct. Don't know what these people are yet. Don't want a body count on an unknown world before you understand who you're fighting. 2 more scouts came at the frame together, and here the frame's other systems woke fully, a flicker of pale energy gathering around its form, a faint shimmer in the air that Mablung's eye read, wrongly, as some trick of moonlight through mist, until the nearest scout's blade passed clean through empty space where the frame's chest had been a half-second before, and the frame itself seemed to simply arrive 6 feet to the left, already turning, already striking. The second scout's blade knocked wide by a blow that rang off pale armor without so much as scoring the plating beneath. "That's not possible," Damrod breathed, and Mablung found he had no argument to offer him, because he was watching a thing move through 9 armed men, with the calm, contemptuous ease of a wolf, moving through a flock of sheep that had, somehow, all been convinced they were the predators in this exchange. It was not slaughter. Mablung made himself watch closely enough to be certain of that, even through his own rising dread. Every blow the pale figure landed was placed with a precision that spoke of restraint rather than fury. Joints struck rather than throats opened. Men dropped rather than killed. And the Sauron leader, the broad-shouldered man with the red sash, found himself disarmed and pinned face down in the leaf litter, with a knee planted between his shoulder blades, before he had managed to land a single blow of his own. The frame's energy blade held with clinical stillness, an inch above the back of his neck. A threat made, not carried out. For 3 full breaths, nothing moved. The remaining Sauron scouts, those still standing, had scattered back into the trees, too frightened now to press an attack that had cost them nothing but pride, and 2 dislocated shoulders inside of 20 seconds. The pinned leader lay gasping curses in his own tongue into the dirt, and the frame simply held its position, blade steady, head, if the smooth blank helm could be called a head, tilted very slightly, as if listening for something. Then, in a voice that came from nowhere Mablung's eye could locate, not from the frame's helm, not from any mouth at all, but simply present in the air the way a struck bell's note is present, it spoke. "Where is this?" The words carried no accent Mablung could place, no warmth, no threat either, only a strange flat clarity, as though the speaker were asking the question of the trees themselves, rather than the frightened man pinned beneath its knee. The Sauron leader, not understanding a word of the common speech the question had somehow been rendered into, only sobbed out something in his own tongue that needed no translation to be understood as a plea. The frame lifted its blade a fraction, not lowering the threat, but easing it, and Mablung understood, watching from the ridge with his heart hammering against his ribs, that he had just witnessed something choose not to kill a man it could have killed a dozen different ways in the space of a single breath. Beside him, Damrod had gone very pale. "Mablung," he whispered, "we should go. We should go now. Before it. Wait." Mablung's voice was barely more than shaped breath, his eyes never leaving the scene below. "Look at it. It let him live. It struck to disable, not to kill, in every blow I saw. That is not the mark of some mindless horror out of the enemy's forges." He drew a slow breath, steadying himself against the tremor still running through his hands. "That is the mark of discipline. Whatever it is, it chooses." The frame released the Sauron leader a moment later, stepping back and allowing the man to scramble, gasping, into the dark after his scattered fellows, and made no move to pursue. It stood alone now in the small clearing, energy blade guttering down to nothing at its side, and turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the exact rise where Mablung and Damrod lay hidden, as if it had known all along, throughout the entire encounter, exactly where they were, the vertical seam of light where its face should have been fixed, unmistakably, on their position. Neither man breathed. "I know you're there," the voice said again, quieter now, and there was something in it, some faint fraying at the edge of that flat clarity, that Mablung, against every instinct 30 years of ranging had trained into him, found himself reading not as menace, but as something closer to exhaustion. "You've been following for hours. If you meant to kill me, you'd have loosed an arrow already." Damrod's hand had gone white-knuckled around his bow. Mablung laid a hand over his wrist. A silent command, hold, and rose, slowly, from the cover of the ridge, both hands lifted where the pale figure below could see them, empty of any weapon. "We mean you no harm," Mablung called down, keeping his voice level through sheer force of will. "Not yet, and not unless you give us cause. I am Mablung of Ithilien, a captain in the service of Gondor. You are—" He hesitated, searching for the word, and found none that fit. "You are not of any people I know." The pale figure was silent for a long moment, the winter sky light along its limbs pulsing slow and even, like a held breath. "No," it said finally. "I'm not." And somewhere far above the ridge, though neither ranger could have said exactly when it began, the wind through Ithilien's high branches had gone very, very still, as if the wood itself, ancient and listening, had leaned in to hear what would be said next. Mablung had faced down orcs at spear point, had stood his ground once against a Nazgul's shadow passing low over Osgiliath's ruined streets, and had believed, in both those moments, that he understood the particular kind of fear that came from facing something the mind could not fully close its hand around. He found now, standing on an open rise with his palms lifted and empty, before a thing that had just dismantled 9 armed men without shedding a drop of their blood, that he had understood only a fraction of it. "You speak the common tongue," he said, when the silence had stretched long enough that Damrod's breathing beside him had become audible. "How is that possible, if you are not of any people we know?" "I don't," the voice answered, and again Mablung noted that strange placeless quality to it, as though the words arrived in his mind fully formed, rather than traveling through the air to his ears. "Something translates. I don't fully understand it either. My ship usually handles languages I don't know. I don't have my ship right now." There was a rawness underneath that last sentence, brief and quickly smoothed over, that snagged at something in Mablung's chest, despite every warning instinct still screaming at him to knock an arrow and put a ranger's trust in speed and steel, rather than words. He had spent enough years reading men, reading what lay beneath what they chose to say, to recognize the shape of someone trying very hard not to sound afraid. "Your ship," Mablung repeated carefully. "You fell from the sky. We saw the—" He groped for a word Faramir would have supplied more easily, some captain's gift for finding the right term under pressure that Mablung, a tracker and not a scholar, had never fully possessed. The tear, the wound in the sky, and the light that came through it, and then it closed, and you were on the ground where nothing living should have survived such a fall. "It's called the Void," the figure said, "or it was supposed to be. I was mid-transit, moving between 2 points, the way I've done 1,000 times, and something interrupted it. Threw me somewhere the void doesn't reach. I don't have a name for wherever this is, because I've never been here, and until about 4 hours ago I didn't know a place like this could exist outside of everywhere I've ever been." Damrod, still crouched behind Mablung with an arrow not quite drawn, found his voice at last, low and taut. "It talks like a man, or something wearing the shape of speaking like one." "I am a man," the figure said, and something in the flatness of the reply made both rangers go still. "Inside this, there's someone inside this, piloting it, the same way you're inside whatever you'd call a pause, as if searching for the right comparison and finding the gap between 2 entirely foreign worlds, too wide to easily bridge. The same way a man is inside his own skin. This is armor. It isn't me, but it's also not me, if that makes any sense to you, which I doubt it does." Mablung lowered his hands slowly, though he kept his weight balanced, ready to move. "It does not, entirely, but I have met stranger claims and found them true. Elf lords who have walked this world since before the sun and moon were hung in the sky. A wizard who is not, I am told, truly a man at all, but something older wearing a man's shape by design and purpose. I have learned not to measure truth only by how easily it fits inside what I already understand. For the first time since the encounter began, the figure below seemed to shift its weight. Not a combat stance, but something closer, Mablung thought, to the particular stillness of someone genuinely startled by an answer they hadn't expected to receive. That's another pause. That's a more reasonable response than I was braced for. Should I have expected less reason from you? Mablung asked, and let a thin thread of dry humor into it, testing the ground the way he might test ice on a winter stream. Carefully, weight shifting slowly forward, ready to retreat at the first crack. Where I'm from, the last time something fell out of the sky uninvited, the people who found it tried to shoot it first and ask questions never. A beat. You're doing better than that already. We are rangers of Ithilien, Mablung said. We do not loose arrows at shadows we do not understand, not until understanding has been tried and failed. That is not mercy. It is discipline, and my captain's order, and 30 years of learning that the wood punishes men who act before they think. He drew a slow breath. But you should know this also. We do not extend that patience forever, and we are not the only power in this land who will come looking for what fell from your torn sky tonight. Word will already be moving toward Minas Tirith, toward Rivendell, toward eyes far less patient than mine. If you mean to survive what is coming, you would do well to answer plainly. And now, while it is only 2 rangers asking, the figure was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke again, the flatness in its voice had shifted into something more careful, more measured. The voice, Mablung thought, of someone recalculating an approach mid-conversation, the way a skilled negotiator might, or a soldier used to reading a room and adjusting the terms of engagement in real time. My name, the name my people use for what I am, is Tenno. A pause. I don't know if that word means anything here. It wouldn't, would it? You've never had a war like the one that made us. Tell me of that war, Mablung said. Or tell me nothing, and we will simply watch each other until my captain arrives to ask the same question with rather more men at his back. The choice is yours, but I would rather hear it from you than guess at it from your works, and I have already seen tonight what your works can do to armed men who mean you harm. There was something almost like a low, humorless huff of breath from the figure below. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one, the ghost of a reaction that suggested, however briefly, an actual person listening from somewhere behind that blank, faceless helm. Fair, the voice said. Short version then, because the long version would take longer than either of us probably has before more of your people show up with better aim than the last group. A beat gathering itself. Where I'm from, there was an empire. It experimented on children, took them, changed them, tried to make them into something that could survive a war between much older, much worse things. Most of those children didn't survive the changing. The ones who did came out the other side as something the empire hadn't planned for. Not obedient weapons, but something that could think for itself, and eventually turned on the people who'd made us. That war's still going, in pieces, all these centuries later. I've spent most of my life fighting parts of it. I'm good at it. I didn't ask to be, but I am. Mablung listened, and felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold, because he had heard grief shaped like that before. Not in these exact words, never in words so strange, but in the particular flatness of a man describing a wound so old it no longer bled, only ached, in weather like this. He thought, unbidden, of Frodo's face the one time he had glimpsed the ring-bearer passing through these very woods months past. The same hollowed, burdened quality behind the eyes, the look of someone carrying a war that the world around them could not fully see. You did not choose this, Mablung said quietly. It was not quite a question. No, the figure said. None of us did. But you learn to hold the weapon anyway, because the alternative is worse people holding it instead. Above them, unseen by either ranger, the last thin scraps of cloud had cleared from the night sky, and starlight fell clean and cold and ancient across the clearing, where a boy who had once been made into a weapon, and a ranger who had spent his whole life guarding a wood against exactly such unknown things, stood, for one strange suspended moment, simply looking at one another across a gulf neither fully understood. It was Damrod who broke the silence, his voice tight but no longer trembling. "Mablung, Faramir will want to know all of this himself, and hearing it second-hand from us will serve no one well. We should bring word, and bring it carefully, before this thing's patience or ours runs out." Mablung nodded slowly, not taking his eyes from the pale figure below. "Will you come with us?" he asked it, not as a captive, as what you claim to be, a stranger asking, as much as demanding, for a place in a world that owes you nothing yet. "My captain is a fair man, fairer than most in this age of the world have cause to be. He will hear you before he judges you. That is more than most strangers who fall into Ithilien uninvited are given." The figure below was silent for a long moment, weighing something Mablung could not see, and somewhere inside the frame's narrow chest, in the small dark chamber where the true self still rode hidden, the operator turned the offer over with the particular caution of someone who had learned, across a lifetime of wars not of their choosing, that trust extended too quickly was usually trust about to be spent. But there was also this: no ship, no signal, no void reaching back to answer any call sent into it. A world entire, stretched out in every direction, that the operator did not understand even slightly, and two men standing in the dark who had, when they held every advantage, chosen words instead of arrows. "All right," the voice said finally, quiet now, almost gentle. "Take me to your captain." And so, beneath a sky finally settling back into its old, unbroken order of stars, two rangers of Ithilien turned south toward the hidden refuge of Denethor and walked beside them, matching their pace with an unnerving, silent ease, something Middle-earth had no name for yet, though before the moon set again, it would have several, and not all of them kind. Denethor lay hidden behind a curtain of falling water, a cave carved deep into the rock where the river Anduin's tributary spilled off a high shelf of stone in a perpetual silver veil, and it had sheltered Faramir's company through 2 winters of a war that showed no sign of ending. Mablung had walked through that curtain more times than he could count, had long ago stopped flinching at the cold shock of water against his neck, but tonight, leading a stranger wrapped in pale, humming armor through the falls for the first time, he felt the old familiar passage transformed into something else entirely, a threshold being crossed that could not, once crossed, be uncrossed. The frame passed through the water without breaking stride, without so much as a shudder at the cold, and came out the other side dry, not merely shaking off the wet the way a cloak sheds rain, but entirely, impossibly dry, as though the water itself had simply declined to cling to it. Damrod, coming through just behind, caught the sight of that, and went very still, and Mablung understood without a word passing between them that this small, strange detail had unsettled the younger ranger more than the fight in the clearing had. Inside the cave, torchlight threw long shadows across rough-hewn walls, and the 24 rangers gathered there, men cleaning weapons, tending a low fire, murmuring over a shared meal of stream-caught fish and hard bread, fell into a silence so total and so sudden that Mablung heard the fires crackle, as if for the first time, every eye in the chamber fixed on the pale, faceless figure standing dry and unnervingly still just inside the cave mouth, energy lines pulsing faint and slow along its limbs like something breathing. Faramir rose from where he had been crouched beside the fire, and crossed the chamber with the unhurried, deliberate calm that Mablung had watched him cultivate across years of command. A calm Mablung knew, from long acquaintance, was not the absence of fear, but its careful, disciplined containment. "Captain," Mablung said, inclining his head, "this is what fell from the sky tonight. It calls itself." He glanced toward the frame, uncertain even now of the correct word to offer. "Tenno. It says there is a man inside, piloting the armor as a man might pilot a boat, or wear a coat. It fought 9 Southron scouts not an hour past, and left every one of them living, though it could have killed them all without effort. I believed it worth bringing before you rather than leaving in the dark for others to find with less patience than we showed it." Faramir's gray eyes moved over the frame slowly, missing nothing. The strange proportions, the faceless helm, the thin cyan light tracing its limbs like veins. And Mablung, who had served under this man long enough to read the small tells beneath his composure, saw the flicker of genuine astonishment there, quickly folded away behind the same careful stillness Faramir brought to every unknown thing the war put in his path. "You have a voice," Faramir said at last, addressing the frame directly, his tone even, testing. "I would hear it, if you're willing to use it plainly. I find I have very little patience left, after 2 years of this war, for riddles." "Then I won't waste your patience with any," the frame answered, and around the cave several rangers flinched visibly at the sourceless, placeless quality of the voice, a sound that seemed to arrive in the mind rather than travel through the ear. "I fell here by accident, through no doing of anyone in this world. I don't know where here is beyond what your ranger told me on the way. Ithilien, Gondor, a war against something called Sauron that sounds, from the little I've heard, uncomfortably familiar. I have no ship, no allies, no way home that I've found yet. I'm not here to conquer anything. I'd like, if it's possible, not to be killed by people who haven't done anything to deserve fighting me, and I'd like some idea of where I've actually landed." Faramir was quiet for a long moment, weighing the words the way Mablung had watched him weigh reports from spies and confessions from captured enemies alike, sifting for the shape of truth beneath the surface of what was said. "You fought 9 armed men," Faramir said, "and killed none of them. That is either great restraint or a great weakness you wish to conceal. Which was it?" "Restraint," the frame said, without hesitation. "I didn't know who they were, or what quarrel, if any, they had with me. Where I come from, killing first and understanding later, has a way of making enemies out of people who might have been something else, given the chance. I've made that mistake before. I try not to make it twice." Something in that answer settled visibly across Faramir's shoulders. Not full trust, Mablung thought, nothing so quick or so foolish as that, but the loosening of a coiled readiness that had been wound tight since the moment he'd walked into the cave. Faramir had spent 2 years of war learning to read the small, unteachable signs of a man's true character beneath his words, and whatever test he had just run, the stranger had passed at least the first threshold of it. "Sit then," Faramir said, and gestured toward the fire, an invitation that drew a low murmur of disbelief from several of the watching rangers. "Or stand, if sitting does not suit whatever you are. I would hear the whole of your account, and I would hear it before I decide what word to send to my father in Minas Tirith, because word of a tear in the sky over Ithilien will reach the city with or without my telling of it, and I would rather the first account he hears be a true one, from my own hand, than a rumor grown wild in the telling." The frame did not sit. Mablung noted this, filed it away with the rest of the night's strange details, but it settled into a stillness that read, somehow, as an equivalent gesture, energy dimming further along its limbs, posture easing from readiness into something closer to rest. "My name for what I am is Tenno," it said again, and this time, standing in firelight before a captain's full attention, the account came fuller, more measured. The story of an empire that had reached across the stars and taken children to shape into weapons against enemies older and stranger than anything Faramir's wars had prepared him to imagine. Of a war between that empire and the very weapons it had made. A war still smoldering in scattered corners centuries on. Of a void that ran beneath and through everything the speaker had ever known. A place both weapon and wound that had thrown them here by some accident. Neither the void nor its passenger yet understood. Faramir listened without interrupting, his face schooled to careful neutrality, though Mablung, watching his captain as closely as he watched the stranger, saw the moment something in the account struck home. It came when the frame described, in its flat, careful way, what it meant to be made into a weapon rather than choosing to become one. The particular grief of never having been asked. "I have a brother," Faramir said quietly, when the account had wound to its close, "who was shaped by our father's ambitions into something he might never have chosen for himself, had the choosing been his alone. I do not say this to claim I understand the whole of what you've described. I do not, and would not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I understand something of what it is to carry a burden you did not ask for, and to be measured, always, against what others needed you to become, rather than what you are." He was quiet a moment, firelight moving across the weathered lines of his face. "That is not nothing, between strangers. It is a place to begin, at least. It's more than I expected," the frame said, and there was, again, that faint fraying at the edge of its flat voice, something that Mablung, listening closely, was beginning to recognize as the sound of someone who had braced for cruelty, and kept receiving, instead, something closer to grace. "Do not mistake this for full trust," Faramir said, and his tone sharpened slightly, the captain reasserting himself over the man who had, for a moment, let his guard soften. "I have a war to fight, and a city to protect, and I have seen enough of this world's true horrors wearing false faces to know that a fair account tonight is no guarantee of a fair heart. You will stay within this refuge, under watch, until I have sent word to those with more authority than I, to judge what should be done with you. That is not a cage, it is caution, and I think, if you are what you claim, you understand the difference better than most." "I understand it," the frame said. "I'd probably ask the same, in your position." Faramir nodded once, satisfied, and turned to Mablung. "Send the fastest rider we have toward Minas Tirith before dawn, with a full account under my seal. My father will want to know of this himself, and I would rather he hear it plainly from me than twisted through a dozen mouths by the time it reaches the city." He paused, glancing once more at the still, pale figure seated, or as near to seated as its strange proportions allowed, beside the fire. "And send a second rider toward Rivendell, if any among us know the paths well enough to attempt it in secret. If this void, this tear in the sky, is a working of some power we do not understand, then Elrond's house has stood against stranger things than Sauron's malice in ages past. They should know what has fallen into the world, before the world learns to fear it without understanding it first." Mablung inclined his head and moved to give the orders, and around the firelit cave, the low murmur of 24 frightened, curious rangers slowly resumed. A company of men settling, uneasily, around the fact that something entirely unprecedented had just sat down among them, and had not, so far, given them any cause beyond its own strangeness to regret the choice. But Faramir, watching the pale, quiet figure across the fire with the same careful attention he gave to every unresolved question the war set before him, found himself thinking of something else entirely. Of Boromir, his brother, gone now into whatever fate the quest to Rivendell had carried him toward, and of the particular ache of watching someone else's burden and recognizing, uncomfortably, a shadow of his own. "Word will move faster than I can control now," he thought, watching sparks rise toward the cave's dark ceiling, toward my father, who trusts nothing he cannot command, toward Rivendell, whose counsel is wise but whose patience for the unknown is not infinite, and toward eyes I cannot see at all. For nothing so strange falls into this world without someone, somewhere, taking notice. He was more right than he knew. Far to the east, in a tower of black stone rising above a land of ash and fire, something vast and patient, and utterly without mercy, had already felt the tremor of the rift's opening, ripple faintly across senses that spanned far wider than any mortal realm. A disturbance too brief, too strange, to yet be understood, but noted all the same, and filed away in a memory that forgot nothing, and forgave less. The storm that had begun as a single tear in Ithilien's sky had not yet begun to gather its full weight, but somewhere in the dark beyond the mountains it had already, quietly, begun to listen. The rider Faramir sent toward Minas Tirith was a young ranger named Anborn, chosen for his speed and his discretion in equal measure, and he made the 3 days' hard ride through Ithilien's hunted paths and across the Pelinor's open fields in barely 2, arriving at the great gate with his horse lathered white, and his voice hoarse from a message he had rehearsed so many times in the saddle that the words had worn smooth as river stone by the time he finally spoke them aloud. He was brought before the steward within the hour. Denethor did not, whatever else might be said of him, keep urgent news waiting on ceremony, and found the Lord of Gondor seated in the great hall of the White Tower, exactly as rumor always painted him, upright in the black stone chair beneath the empty throne, hands folded, face carved from something harder and colder than the marble around him. "Speak," Denethor said, before Anborn had fully caught his breath. "My son sends word rarely, and never lightly. What has happened in Ithilien?" Anborn spoke the account as Faramir had drilled it into him, plainly, without embellishment, the tear in the sky, the fallen stranger, the 9 Southron scouts disabled without a single death among them, the stranger's own account of an empire and a war, and a void that had thrown it here by accident. He watched, as he spoke, the steward's face for any crack in that carved composure, and found, to his quiet unease, that there was none. Denethor listened to a report of the impossible with the same flat, assessing stillness he might have given a report of grain stores or border skirmishes, and when Anborn finished, the silence that followed stretched long enough that the young ranger began to wonder if he had somehow failed to make himself understood. "A weapon," Denethor said at last, "shaped from a stolen child, fallen out of a tear in the sky, that disarmed 9 trained men without effort, and chose, of its own will, to spare them all." He said it slowly, turning the words over like a man testing a blade's balance before deciding whether to trust it in a fight. "And my son has taken this thing into his refuge and fed it at his own fire. He judged it worth understanding before judging it worth fearing, my lord," Anborn said carefully. "He asks your counsel, and asks that word be sent also to Rivendell, in case Lord Elrond's house holds any knowledge of such a tear in the world's fabric that we in Gondor do not." Something crossed Denethor's face at the mention of Rivendell, brief, and gone almost before Anborn could name it, but he thought, uneasily, that it had looked something like contempt. "Elrond's counsel," Denethor said, "has served this city poorly enough in matters closer to home. I will not wait upon it for a matter that has fallen, by whatever accident, into Gondor's own woods, under my own son's watch." He rose from the black chair, and though he was not a young man, the motion carried a coiled, dangerous energy that made Anborn take an involuntary half-step back. "A power capable of what you describe, capable of disarming 9 men in a heartbeat, and choosing, by its own account, whether they live or die, is not a stray dog to be fed scraps and trusted at a fire. It is a weapon, and Gondor has desperate need, in this hour, of weapons." "My lord," Anborn said, alarm sharpening his voice before he could soften it into proper deference, "Captain Faramir did not send this word to ask that the stranger be seized or bound. He sent it seeking counsel on how best to, "My son," Denethor cut in, and his voice had gone very quiet, which Anborn, who had served long enough in the city to know the steward's moods, understood to be far more dangerous than any shout, "sends me caution and half measures when Gondor bleeds. He would befriend a fallen star and ask my blessing for it, while his brother—" He stopped himself, some old grief closing over the sentence before it could finish, and when he spoke again, his voice had steadied back into its usual iron calm. "Send word back to Ithilien. I will send my own men to see this stranger for myself, and to judge whether it serves Gondor's need, or merely satisfies my son's curiosity about wonders that ought, by rights, to serve the war, rather than distract from it." Anborn opened his mouth to protest further and found, under the full weight of Denethor's flat black stare, that the words would not come. He bowed instead, and withdrew, carrying with him a growing unease that no amount of hard riding back toward Ithilien would fully outpace. Some 500 leagues to the east, in a tower built from black stone and older malice, Sauron felt the tremor again. Clearer this time. No longer a single fleeting disturbance, but a presence, small and strange, and entirely unlike anything his long dominion over Middle-earth's patterns of power had ever catalogued. He had felt the world's currents shift countless times across the ages, the coming of the Astari, the forging and breaking of rings, the slow, grinding movements of armies, and the swifter, sharper movements of individual wills, bent toward defiance or toward him. And he understood each of those shifts, in their season, as variations on patterns he had studied for 3 ages of the world. This was not a variation. This was something with no pattern at all. He withdrew his attention, for a time, from the 1,000 lesser threads he kept woven through Middle-earth's darkness. The movements of his armies mustering in the south and east, the slow poison he fed into weak or willing minds through word and whisper, the distant, patient hunt his Nazgul carried out along roads that would, he was certain, eventually yield the halfling and the ring it carried, and turn the full, terrible weight of his regard toward the west, toward Ithilien, toward the faint and fading echo of whatever had torn briefly through the fabric of the world and left something behind. He could not see it clearly. That, more than anything, unsettled him. In whatever cold and ancient way an unsettlement could still register in something that had ceased, long ago, to feel fear as lesser beings understood it. He had eyes across the whole of Middle-earth, the Nazgul's dread senses, the treachery of Palantiri, the countless small betrayals and whispered reports that flowed toward Barad-dûr from every corner of the world, where his will had taken even the faintest root. And this new thing sat behind all of it like a stone dropped into still water, visible only by the ripples it left rather than by any shape he could directly perceive. Interesting, he thought, and the thought carried in it something almost like anticipation, an old and patient hunger stirring at the prospect of a new variable entering a game he had, until now, believed himself to have fully mapped. A power that does not answer to the rings, nor to the old magics of the elves, nor to anything born of this world at all. He did not move against it yet. Sauron had not endured 3 ages of defeat and slow rebuilding by acting on incomplete information, and this, whatever it was, remained, for now, dangerously incomplete. But he set a portion of his vast, patient attention toward it nonetheless, a single dark thread woven in among the 1,000 others, waiting, watching, gathering what fragments of understanding he could from the world's trembling reaction to something it had no name for. Let the little kingdoms of men fumble toward their own understanding first, he thought, and there was something in the thought that might, in a lesser being, have been called amusement. Let Denethor's pride and Elrond's caution war with each other over how to answer it. Whatever conclusion they reach, I will already know more than they do, and when the time comes to claim what has fallen into this world, I will not ask it kindly to serve. Far below the tower's black foundations, in the deep places where his will took its most direct and terrible shape, a single order went out, quiet, patient, unhurried, to certain servants who moved through Middle-earth's shadows unseen by the free people's eyes. Watch the woods of Ithilien. Learn what walks there. Bring me word before you bring me blood. In Rivendell, the news came differently, not by rider, for no messenger from Gondor had yet reached so far, but by a subtler and older means. Elrond had felt the tremor too, in his own way, through senses honed across an age longer than most mortal kingdoms had stood at all, a disturbance in the deep, old patterns of the world that even Vilya's power, bound as it was to preservation and protection, could not fully parse. He sat long into that night in his private study, a scroll of old lore spread unread before him, and thought not of armies or weapons but of history, of the first coming of the Astari into the world, wrapped in mortal shape and mortal weakness by the choice of the Valar, of the breaking of the world at the fall of Númenor, when the very shape of Middle-earth had been remade by powers few now living could fully comprehend, of every other moment across 3 ages when something had entered the world's pattern from outside it, and the long, difficult work of understanding what it meant before that understanding came too late. Something has fallen into the world that does not belong to it, he thought, watching lamplight gutter low against the study's stone walls, not out of the void that swallowed Númenor, not out of the old magic of the Valar, nor the deeper darkness of the enemy's forging. Something else. Something new. He rose finally, and crossed to the tall window that looked out over Rivendell's silver falls, and stood there a long while in the cool night air, weighing what he had felt against 3 ages of hard-won wisdom about the cost of acting in haste on incomplete knowledge. "Send word to Mithrandir, if he can be found," he said quietly, to the silent room, though no one else stood within it to hear the order. A habit of long solitude, thinking aloud to steady his own thoughts before committing them to action. "And prepare a rider for Gondor, discreet and swift. Whatever has fallen into Ithilien's woods, it will need more than Denethor's pride and Faramir's caution to answer it wisely. It will need eyes that have seen the world remade before, and lived to tell of what such remaking costs." Behind him, the stars wheeled slow and ancient over Rivendell's hidden valley, indifferent to the small, urgent councils of elves and men stirring awake beneath them. And far to the west, in a cave behind a curtain of falling water, the stranger who had caused all this quiet, gathering alarm sat by a ranger's fire, still waiting to learn just how large the storm his arrival had set loose across the world would eventually grow. Denethor's men arrived at Henneth noon 3 days later, and Mablung knew trouble the moment he saw who led them. Not a captain of the Rangers, not one of Faramir's own trusted lieutenants, but a hard-eyed officer of the city guard named Onrand, a man Mablung had crossed paths with, only rarely, and never comfortably, known throughout the garrison for a loyalty to the steward, so absolute, it left little room for anything so soft as independent judgment. Onrand came through the waterfall's curtain with 10 men at his back, all of them armored for war rather than woodland scouting, and his eyes found the pale, still figure seated near the cave's fire, before they found Faramir at all. "Captain," Onrand said, inclining his head with just enough correctness to avoid open insult, "the Lord Steward sends his instruction. The stranger is to be brought to Minas Tirith, under guard, that its usefulness to Gondor's war might be properly assessed." Faramir rose from where he had been reviewing a scout's report, and Mablung, watching his captain's face, saw the careful stillness there settle into something harder. "My father's instruction," Faramir said evenly, "or my father's demand. They are the same thing, Captain. When the word comes from the steward's own seal." Onrand held out a folded parchment, and Faramir took it, broke the seal, and read it in silence, his jaw tightening by degrees with each line. "Whatever conversation is happening, the frame's voice said quietly, from beside the fire, drawing every eye in the chamber. "I'd rather be included in it than talked about like I'm not here." Faramir looked up from the parchment, and something in his expression, a kind of tired, resigned honesty, softened slightly as he addressed the frame directly, rather than the officer who delivered the order. "My father wishes you brought to Minas Tirith, under guard, to determine your," his word, "usefulness to Gondor's war effort." He folded the parchment closed. "I will not pretend to you that this is a request rather than a command, nor that refusing it carries no cost. My father does not forgive refusal easily, and I have already spent what little patience he holds for me on a war I did not choose the shape of." The cave had gone very quiet. Mablung found his hand had drifted, without conscious decision, toward the hilt of his sword, and made himself still it. Whatever came next, a ranger's blade drawn against Gondor's own guard would resolve nothing well. "And if I decline?" the frame asked. There was no heat in the question, no threat either, only the same flat, careful evaluation it seemed to bring to everything, weighing consequence before committing to any path. "Then I expect Anrand has instruction for that circumstance as well," Faramir said, "though I would ask that we not test what those instructions might be. I have seen what you did to 9 armed men in Ithilien's dark, without drawing a killing blow. I do not believe 10 more, however loyal to my father, would fare any better, and I would rather not watch good men of Gondor die proving a point none of us need proven." The frame was silent for a long moment, and Mablung, watching closely, saw something shift in its posture. Not fear, precisely, but a kind of weighing stillness that reminded him uncomfortably of a hunted animal, calculating the odds of a dozen different paths at once. "I'm not going to fight my way out of a room full of people who haven't actually threatened me yet," the frame said finally, and there was something almost weary in it. "I've done enough of that already, on worlds that made more sense to me than this one does. But I want it understood, plainly, before I go anywhere. I'm choosing this, not because your steward commands it, but because your captain asked, and asking is worth more to me than commanding ever will be." Faramir held the frame's blank, faceless gaze for a long moment, or what passed for a gaze, that thin, vertical seam of light that gave nothing away and somehow, still, felt like being seen. "I understand the distinction," he said quietly, "and I will remember it, whatever comes of this in Minas Tirith." The road to the White City took the better part of 2 days, and Mablung, riding alongside the strange column at Faramir's insistence, spent much of it watching the stranger walk, for it would not ride, claiming some difficulty with the fit of Gondor's saddles that Mablung suspected was as much a matter of trust as of practicality. Pace evenly beside the horses, without once tiring, without once breaking the same eerily precise gait that had first marked its trail through Ithilien's dark. They came within sight of Minas Tirith on the evening of the 2nd day, and Mablung watched the frame go very still at its first glimpse of the White City rising tier upon tier against the darkening sky, white stone catching the last gold light of a dying sun, the great tower at its summit crowned in a banner that had, for 2 years now, flown at half-mast in a silent city's grief. "That's beautiful," the frame said, quiet enough that Mablung barely caught it, and there was something in the flat voice that had, for just a moment, lost its careful edge entirely. "I don't think I've seen anything like that, not on any world I've walked." "It was more beautiful once," Mablung said, and found himself, unexpectedly, wanting the stranger to understand this, wanting it to see, not merely the wonder of the city's white stone, but the long grief woven beneath it. Before the war, before the steward lost a son to it, and half a heart with him. Gondor endures, but it does not shine the way it did in the old songs, and every year of this war dims it a little further. The frame was quiet a long moment, watching the city grow larger and paler against the coming dark as their column wound closer along the road. "Where I'm from," it said finally, "there's an old story. Older than the war I told you about. Older than most things anyone still remembers clearly. About a city like that. Golden, once. Broken by its own people's fear before anything from outside ever touched it." A pause. I didn't understand, until right now, why that story always stuck with me more than the others. Mablung had no answer for that, and did not try to find one. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and the great gates of Minas Tirith opened before them into a city that had already, in the 2 days since Anran's departure, begun to fill with whispered rumor of what walked toward it. A fallen star, a weapon shaped from a stolen child, a thing that had disarmed 9 men without spilling blood, and now came, under guard, to stand before a steward who trusted almost nothing he could not command outright. Above the city, in the tower's highest chamber, Denethor watched the columns approach from a narrow window, his black eyes tracking the pale, unhurried figure walking at its center, with an intensity that made the guard standing silent at his shoulder distinctly uneasy. A weapon, Denethor thought, watching the last light fade from the sky behind the approaching column. Gondor has bled for 2 years on weapons of steel and men's flesh, both running short. If this thing is even half what the reports claim, if it can be bent to serve rather than merely observed, it may yet be the difference between the city's survival and its fall. He turned from the window at last, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the flat, absolute certainty of a man who had already decided, in his own mind, exactly how tonight's meeting would end. "Bring it to the hall," he said. "I would see for myself what has fallen into my son's careless hands, and decide, myself, what Gondor's need makes it wise to do about it." The Hall of Kings had not been built for a meeting like this. Its vast pillars of gray stone rose into shadow far overhead, each one carved in the likeness of long-dead kings, whose names Mablung had learned as a boy, and now, walking beneath their silent stone gazes with a stranger at his side, found himself reciting internally, like a charm, against whatever was about to happen, a habit of nerves he hadn't indulged since his first battle. Denethor sat in the black chair beneath the empty throne, exactly as he had for Anborn's report 3 days past, and this time the hall was not empty around him. A dozen guards lined the walls in full battle dress, and Faramir stood near his father's chair with the particular rigid posture Mablung had learned, across years of service, meant the captain was holding his temper in check through sheer force of will. The frame walked the length of the hall without hesitation, footsteps silent on ancient stone, and stopped a respectful distance before the steward's chair, close enough for conversation, far enough to make clear it had not come as a captive to be paraded. "So," Denethor said, and his voice filled the vast hall without effort, carrying the particular cold authority of a man who had ruled through grief and war for longer than most of his officers had been alive. "The wonder my son found in the woods. Tell me, stranger, what use are you to Gondor?" "I didn't come here to be useful to anyone," the frame said, and Mablung, standing near enough to see Faramir's jaw tighten at the answer, understood immediately that this would not go the way the steward had planned it. "I came here because a tear opened in the sky and threw me somewhere I didn't choose. I've been honest with your son, and honest with your rangers about exactly that much, and I intend to keep being honest with you, even if it's not the answer you're hoping for. An honest answer," Denethor said, "is not the same as a useful one. Gondor bleeds, stranger. Osgiliath burns and rebuilds and burns again. My eldest son is gone into Rivendell chasing counsel that has yet to bear any fruit worth the wait, and every week that passes, Sauron's armies grow while mine do not. I have watched 9 trained men fall to you without a single death among them. A mercy, my son tells me. though I confess I see it rather differently. I see a power capable of ending 9 lives in the time it takes a man to draw breath, and choosing, instead, to demonstrate restraint. That is not the mark of weakness. That is the mark of something holding back its true strength, and I would know why. The frame was quiet for a moment, and Mablung, watching closely, saw its posture shift, not into aggression, but into something more careful, more deliberate, as though it were choosing each word with the precision of a blade being drawn slowly, rather than swung. I held back, it said, because those men hadn't done anything to earn dying. That's not a strategy, Lord Steward. It's a principle. Where I'm from, I've killed more than I can count, and every one of those deaths cost something. Not to me alone, but to what's left of who I was before I became what I am now. I don't spend lives I don't have to spend. If that reads to you as weakness, then we're going to disagree about what strength actually means, and I don't think that disagreement is going to end with me being useful, the way you want. Then tell me what you want, Denethor said, leaning forward slightly, and there was something almost hungry in the question, the sound of a man reaching for any leverage he could find in a war that had, for 2 years, offered him almost none. Every creature that walks under sun or shadow wants something. Safety, purpose, a place to belong, now that whatever home you claim to have lost is beyond your reach. I can offer all 3, stranger, in exchange for a fraction of what you showed my rangers in Ithilien's dark. Fight for Gondor. Stand at the head of my armies when Sauron's forces finally come in full against these walls, and I will see you wanting for nothing this city can provide. The hall had gone utterly silent. Mablung found he was holding his breath, and beside him, Damrod's hand had gone still and white-knuckled at his side. I want to go home, the frame said finally, quiet but clear, carrying easily through the vast silent hall. That's the truest answer I can give you. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if the void that threw me here even remembers I exist, on whatever side of it I've been cut off from. But that's what I want, Lord Steward. Not a throne, not a purpose you hand me, not a war that isn't mine to fight. And until I find a way back to the one that is, I intend to make my own choices about who I help and why, rather than being told by anyone, however well-meaning, what I'm for. Denethor's face did not change, but something in his eyes went very cold, very still. The look, Mablung thought with a sinking heart, of a man recalculating an approach that had just failed entirely. You speak of choice, Denethor said, as though choice were a luxury this world can afford you freely. Let me be plain, stranger. Since you value plainness so highly, Sauron's forces muster in the south and east even as we speak in this hall. When they come, and they will come, sooner than any of us wish, this city will need every strength it can gather, whether that strength comes willingly or otherwise. I would rather have you as an ally, freely given. But do not mistake my offer for the full measure of Gondor's need, nor assume that need will forever ask so politely. Is that a threat, Lord Steward? The frame asked, and its voice had gone very flat, very still, the same tone, Mablung realized with a chill, that it had used in the clearing before disarming 9 men in under a minute. It is a fact, Denethor said. What you choose to call it is your own affair. Faramir stepped forward then, breaking his long silence, and Mablung saw the effort it cost him to keep his voice level before his own father, in front of a full hall of watching guards. Father, this serves nothing. Threatening a power we do not fully understand, in our own hall, is not strategy. It is desperation dressed as strength, and I have watched enough of this war's desperation cost us dearly already. You would have me beg it instead? Denethor's voice sharpened, the cold control fraying at last into something closer to the raw, grief-hardened anger that ran, Mablung knew, just beneath his every carefully measured word. As you begged Rivendell's counsel for your brother, and lost him to it regardless? I have buried enough of this family's hope in careful diplomacy, Faramir. I will not bury Gondor beside it." The words landed in the hall like a physical blow, and Mablung watched Faramir go very pale, very still, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a wound he had long expected, and was still, somehow, not fully braced for. Into that raw, ringing silence, the frame spoke again, quieter now, and something in its flat voice had shifted into an edge Mablung had not yet heard from it. "I'm not going to be anyone's weapon by threat, Lord Steward. Not yours. Not the Empire's I already escaped once. I'll leave this hall the same way I walked in, on my own terms. And if that costs me whatever welcome your city might have offered, then it costs me that, and I'll find another way to understand this world without it." It turned, unhurried, and began to walk back down the long hall toward the doors. And for one taut, breathless moment, Mablung saw every guard along the walls shift their weight, hands drifting toward weapons, waiting on a single word from the steward's chair that would turn this hall into a battlefield. The word did not come. Denethor sat very still, watching the pale figure walk unhurried toward the doors of his own hall, defying him openly before a dozen witnesses, and something in his black eyes, grief or fury, or the particular helpless fury of a proud man watching leverage slip through his fingers, burned there, banked but not extinguished, as the doors of the Hall of Kings swung open and closed again on the retreating figure of something Middle-earth still had no name for, and no way, yet, to hold. The frame walked out through the great gate of Minas Tirith, as the last color drained from the western sky, and no one moved to stop it, not the guards at the gate, who had received no order countermanding the steward's silence, and not Faramir, who caught up to it on the road below the seventh circle with Mablung and Damrod hurrying to keep pace behind him. "Wait," Faramir called, and the frame slowed, though it did not fully stop until he'd drawn level with it, breathing hard from the run down through the city's winding tiers. "Please. Whatever else happened in that hall, that was my father's failure of judgment, not the city's, and not mine. I would not have you leave believing all of Gondor speaks with his voice. I don't think that," the frame said, and some of the flat edge had gone out of its voice, replaced by something closer to the tired, careful register it had used back at the fire in Henneth Anun. "You've been fair with me since the first night, Faramir. So have your rangers. That's not nothing, and I'm not going to pretend it is, just because your father wanted something from me I wasn't willing to give." Faramir was quiet a moment, catching his breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, more private, though Mablung and Damrod stood close enough to hear it regardless. "My father is not a cruel man, whatever this night made him look like. He is a man who has watched this city bleed for 2 years, with too few resources and too little help from those who should have sent it, and grief has narrowed his sight until he sees every unclaimed strength as a resource to be spent, rather than a soul to be respected. That does not excuse tonight, but I would ask you not to let it be the last word you carry about Gondor, or about me." "It won't be," the frame said, and there was something almost gentle in it. "For what it's worth, I understand a version of what you just described better than you probably think. I've served under people who saw exactly what I could do and never once asked what it cost me to do it. Your father's not the first, and where I'm from, he wouldn't even be the worst example. I'm not leaving because I think Gondor is what he made that hall look like tonight. I'm leaving because I need to understand this world on my own terms before I let anyone, even someone as fair as you've been, decide what I'm for." "Where will you go?" Mablung asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. "I don't know yet." A pause, and the frame's faceless helm tilted slightly, as if considering the dark shape of the mountains rising beyond the city's white walls. "Somewhere I can think, somewhere I can try to understand what actually happened to me, and whether there's any way back to what I lost. I'll find you again, Mablung. You and Damrod both, if that's welcome. You were the first people in this world who chose patience over fear, and I don't forget things like that. It's welcome, Mablung said, and meant it. The frame turned then, unhurried, and walked out along the road that led west toward the Pelinor's open fields and the darker country beyond. And within a few minutes its pale shape had faded entirely into the deepening night, leaving Faramir, Mablung, and Damrod standing alone on the road below a city that had, in a single evening, both welcomed and nearly driven away, the strangest thing to fall into Middle-earth in living memory. He'll send men after it, Damrod said quietly, watching the empty dark where the frame had vanished. Your father. He won't simply let it walk free after tonight. No, Faramir agreed, and his voice carried a weariness that went deeper than the night's long hours. He won't, but he'll find, I think, that commanding a thing which has already shown it answers to nothing but its own judgment is rather harder than commanding men who fear him. I only hope that lesson doesn't cost more than my father's pride before it's fully learned. Far to the east, in a fortress carved from black stone, where 9 cloaked riders kept a silence older than grief, one of them stirred at a summons that arrived not through any spoken word, but through the deep, cold current of will that bound all 9 to the dark tower, and the master they served without question or rest. The Witch-king of Angmar, greatest of the Nazgul, received Sauron's instruction, the way he received all such instructions, as a certainty settling into his hollow mind, rather than a command requiring interpretation. Something has fallen into Ithilien that does not answer to any power we have catalogued. Learn what it is. Learn what it fears. Bring word before you bring open conflict. This is not yet the hour to reveal how much attention it has drawn. He gathered 2 of his brethren, lesser among the 9, but formidable still, wraith riders whose very presence unraveled courage from mortal hearts before a blade was ever drawn, and together they took to the dark sky, on wings that had once, in some age long past, belonged to living things, and turned west, toward a white city gleaming faint and vulnerable on the horizon, and the strange, unmapped power that had, 3 nights past, torn a wound in the sky above the woods it guarded. They did not fly toward Minas Tirith directly. Sauron's instruction had been clear on that point, and even the Witch-king, proud and terrible as he was, did not act against his master's explicit caution. Instead, they circled wide, high above the Efelduath's black peaks, riding thermals of cold mountain air with the patient, silent menace of things built for exactly this kind of hunting, searching, in their own dread fashion, for any trace of the disturbance that had rippled so strangely through their master's vast awareness. It was near dawn, the sky beginning to pale toward gray in the east, when the lead Nazgul felt it, a faint, cold wrongness threading through the air far below, over open country west of the city, a presence that carried no scent of fear the way every other living thing in Middle-earth instinctively bled fear into the air at a Nazgul's approach. This did not fear. This simply was, sitting in the dark below like a stone dropped into still water, utterly unmoved by senses that had broken the will of kings, and driven brave men to gibbering madness for 3 ages of the world. The Witch-king wheeled his mount lower, curious now in the cold, patient way that passed for curiosity in something that had long ago traded away every warmer feeling for power, and looked down through the thinning dark at a lone pale figure walking steadily westward across open, empty fields, alone, unhurried, and entirely unnervingly, unafraid of the shadow now circling low and silent above it. Below, the frame felt the change in the air, before it saw the shapes wheeling against the paling sky, a cold that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn chill, a pressure against the mind that the operator, riding hidden and alert within the frame's chest, recognized immediately as something trying to make me afraid, and not quite succeeding. Interesting, the operator thought, watching 3 vast dark shapes circle lower against the gray morning sky, energy already gathering unbidden along the frame's blade in silent readiness. That's new. Above, the Witch-king studied the small pale figure below with cold, dawning calculation, weighing this first true glimpse against everything the fragmentary reports had claimed. A power immune, it seemed, to the one weapon his kind had never yet found a mortal soul able to fully resist. He did not descend to engage. His master's order had been plain, and even the greatest of the 9 did not act rashly against explicit caution. Instead, he wheeled his mount higher, back toward the dark eastern mountains, carrying with him the first true confirmation that whatever had fallen into Ithilien's woods was no mere rumor grown wild in the telling. And far below, watching the shadow retreat into the paling sky, the frame stood alone in an empty field at the edge of dawn, understanding, for the first time since the tear had closed around it, that it had just been marked by something that answered to a will far older, far more patient, and far more dangerous than any steward's throne room could contain. The frame walked for 2 days without direction beyond away from Minas Tirith's white walls, away from the cold weight of the shadow that had circled it at dawn, away from anything that might mistake open country for an invitation to press a claim it had already refused once. It crossed the Pelinor's outer fields under cover of the second night, skirted the edge of a forest the operator's borrowed senses read as older and stranger than anything they'd encountered in Ithilien, and came, on the morning of the 3rd day, to a hollow in the hills where a spring ran clear and cold over gray stone, and stopped there, finally, to do the thing it had been putting off since the moment the tear had closed around it. Think. Inside the frame's narrow chest, in the small dark chamber where the true self rode, the operator sat with knees drawn up against a stillness that had, for 3 days, been drowned out by the constant, grinding necessity of motion. Walk, assess, survive, repeat, and let the silence catch up to them at last. No ship, no Ordis, no Lotus, no void signal on any frequency the frame can throw. The thoughts came slower now, less frantic than they had that first terrible night, worn into something closer to grief than panic by 3 days of unanswered dark. No way home that I can see. Maybe no way home at all. They had faced worse odds before. The second dream had taught them that the void itself was not, in the end, an enemy, but a kind of terrible ancient home, and every mission since had carried its own particular flavor of impossible danger, survived through sheer stubborn refusal to stop moving forward. But every one of those missions had carried, underneath the danger, the certainty of an anchor, a ship waiting, a voice that would answer, a system of stars that, however hostile, at least knew what a Tenno was. This world knew nothing. This world had never heard the word, had no frame of reference for the void, or transference, or the particular grief of a childhood stolen and reshaped into something that could survive wars gods themselves had started. And yet, the operator turned this thought over slowly, testing its edges. This world had also offered, in the space of 3 strange days, things the origin system rarely had. A ranger who chose patience over fear before he understood anything else about the choice. A captain who apologized, plainly and without demanding anything in return, for his own father's cruelty. A city that, however imperfect its steward, had not, in the end, tried to bind the frame by force when words alone had failed to command it. Maybe that's worth something, the operator thought. Maybe I don't have to solve how do I get home today. Maybe today I just have to figure out what kind of thing I'm going to be, in a world that doesn't know what I am yet, because that answer is still mine to choose, whatever else has been taken. It was, they realized slowly, turning the thought over in the quiet of the hollow, almost exactly the question they'd spent their whole life answering, over and over, on every world the old war had ever thrown them onto. Weapon or person, tool or self. The Orokin had tried to answer that question for them once, and failed, in the end, because the failing had made Tenno what they were. Denethor had tried to answer it again, 3 nights past, in a hall of cold stone beneath dead kings' silent gazes, and failed the same way, for the same reason. I already know the answer, the operator thought, and something in the certainty of it steadied them more than 3 days of walking had managed. I just have to keep choosing it, here, the same as everywhere else. The frame rose from where it had settled beside the spring, energy along its limbs brightening from the low, conserving pulse it had held for 3 days of quiet travel back toward something closer to its normal steady glow, and turned, not back toward Minas Tirith, not yet, that wound still too fresh to revisit, but north, toward the far, pale shapes of mountains the operator's borrowed senses had marked, days ago, as the edge of somewhere different, somewhere that Mablung, in one of their long, quiet conversations on the road from Ithilien, had spoken of with a particular reverence Denethor's name had never once earned. Rivendell, the ranger had called it, the House of Elrond, oldest and wisest council left in this world. If anyone in this strange, vast, unmapped world could offer real understanding rather than a leash dressed up as an offer, the operator thought, watching the mountains pale gold under a rising sun, it seemed as good a place as any to finally ask. The rider Elrond had sent toward Gondor 3 days past, a quiet, gray-cloaked elf named Glorfindel, whose name carried weight enough among both elves and men that few questioned his authority to speak for Rivendell's council, arrived at Minas Tirith's gates on the same morning the frame turned its steps north, and found, on entering the city, a steward's hall still simmering with the aftermath of a confrontation 3 nights gone. "You've missed it then," Faramir told him, once the courtesies of greeting had been observed, and the two found a quiet corner of the city's upper tiers to speak plainly. "The stranger left 2 nights past, on its own terms, after my father's." He paused, choosing the word with visible care. Approach did not go as he hoped. Glorfindel listened to the full account without interruption. The tear in the sky, the 9 Southron scouts disarmed without a death among them, Denethor's demand, and the stranger's flat refusal to be claimed as a weapon. The shadow of Nazgul wings that Anborn had reported seeing circle low over the western fields at dawn 2 mornings past. When Faramir finished, the ancient elf lord was quiet a long moment, his pale eyes distant, weighing something against a memory of ages Faramir could only guess at. "I have seen powers enter this world before," Glorfindel said finally. "In ages you have no memory of, Captain, though I carry the memory of them still, however dimly. Powers that came unbidden, unmapped, unbound to any pattern the wise of that age understood. Some brought ruin, some brought salvation none of us had thought to hope for. The difference, always, came down to one thing." He turned his ancient gaze on Faramir, and there was something almost gentle in it, beneath the weight of centuries. "Whether those who found them first chose fear, or chose patience. We chose patience," Faramir said quietly. "My father chose otherwise. So I gather." Glorfindel's mouth curved, faint and humorless. "Elrond will wish to know all of this, and swiftly. If this power was marked by the enemy's own servants at dawn 2 days past, then whatever chance existed of quiet, careful understanding has likely already narrowed considerably." He rose, drawing his gray cloak close. "I will ride for Rivendell within the hour, and send what word I can ahead of me. If your stranger is as wise as your account suggests, Captain, it may already be moving toward the one place in this world still capable of offering it understanding rather than a leash. I would rather Elrond's house be ready to receive it, than have it arrive to find us as unprepared as your father was." He left before midday, riding hard for the hidden valley, and behind him, in the city's high tower, Denethor watched the departure from his narrow window with black eyes that gave away nothing of the cold, patient fury still banked beneath his composure. A steward who had reached for a weapon and found, instead, that the weapon had a will of its own and had already begun, quietly, to consider what other means might yet bring it back within his reach. The road to Rivendell was longer and harder than anything the frame had walked since the Tyr had first thrown it into this world, cutting north through country that grew steadily wilder and stranger with every league, broken hill country giving way to deep old forest, and then to the foothills of mountains that climbed, jagged and gray, into cloud. The operator, riding hidden within the frame's steady, tireless stride, found the days of solitary travel doing something they hadn't expected, settling them, slowly, into a kind of clarity that 3 days of frantic assessment back in Ithilien had never allowed. They were not being hunted, as far as either frame or operator could tell. No more shadow wings circling at dawn, no more cold pressure against the mind, though the memory of that first encounter sat uneasy at the back of every hour's watchfulness, a reminder that whatever power commanded those creatures had already taken notice, and had not yet decided what to do about what it had seen. It was on the 6th day, cresting a high pass between 2 gray peaks with the wind cutting cold and thin at this altitude, that the frame first heard the voices, faint, distant, carried strangely on the mountain air, singing something in a language the operator's borrowed understanding of this world's speech couldn't fully parse, though the shape of it, the aching, layered beauty of it, needed no translation to land somewhere deep and unguarded in the small, tired self riding behind the frame's borrowed eyes. I haven't heard anything like that since. The thought caught, unfinished, on a memory the operator didn't often let themselves linger over. Something half-remembered from before the Orokin's changing, some fragment of music from a childhood that belonged, now, to someone the war had made them stop being. The frame came down off the pass into a valley that seemed, the closer it drew, to exist slightly apart from the harder, wilder country surrounding it, the air warmer, the light softer, the trees taller and older, and somehow more awake than any forest the operator had walked through on this strange world yet. And at the valley's heart, spread along a rushing silver river beneath waterfalls that caught the afternoon light like scattered jewels, stood a house unlike anything either frame or operator had encountered on any world across the whole of their long, strange service. Not fortified, not hidden behind walls of stone, but open, unguarded, and utterly unafraid. A figure was waiting at the valley's edge before the frame had gone another 100 paces. Tall, dark-haired, dressed simply but with an unmistakable bearing of ancient authority, standing alone and unarmed on the path with an ease that struck the operator, after weeks of careful, wary negotiation with every other power this world had thrown at them, as almost startling in its openness. "You've come a long way," the figure said, before the frame had drawn close enough for ordinary speech, his voice carrying easily across the distance in a way that suggested he had, somehow, been expecting this exact arrival. "I am Elrond, and this is my house. You are welcome here, stranger, though I suspect welcome is not a word this world has offered you as freely as it should have these past weeks." "Word travels fast," the frame said, slowing to a stop a respectful distance away, though something in its posture had already begun to ease from the careful readiness it had carried since Minas Tirith. "Word of you has been traveling since the night the sky tore over Ithilien," Elrond said. "Glorfindel brought me Faramir's full account nearly a fortnight past, and I have thought of little else since. A power that entered this world unbidden, that chose mercy over slaughter with 9 armed men at its feet, and refused a steward's crown of iron leverage when it was offered. That is not a small thing to hear of, even in an age as strange and desperate as this one has become. He studied the frame a long moment. Ancient eyes missing nothing. I have counsel to offer you, if you'll hear it. And I suspect, after the welcome Minas Tirith gave you, you have questions you've been waiting a long while to ask someone who might actually have answers. I do, the frame admitted, and there was something almost raw in the flat voice now. 3 weeks of careful guardedness finally, cautiously, beginning to loosen. I don't know if you'll have them, but I'd rather ask and be told I don't know honestly than keep carrying the questions alone. Then come, Elrond said, and turned toward the house behind him, gesturing for the frame to walk beside him rather than behind, an equal rather than a captive or a curiosity. Let us see what answers this house still holds. After 3 ages of gathering wisdom, the world has not always been wise enough to use. They spoke for the better part of that first evening in a quiet chamber overlooking the valley's largest waterfall, and Elrond listened, truly listened, the operator noted, with none of Denethor's hungry calculation, nor even Faramir's careful, watchful kindness, but something closer to the patient attention of a scholar, encountering a genuinely new piece of a puzzle he'd spent millennia assembling, to the full account. The Orokin, the Void, the war that had made Tenno what they were, the tear that had thrown them here, the long, lonely weeks since spent trying to understand a world that had no name for any of it. I will tell you plainly, Elrond said, when the account had wound to its close and the last light had faded from the valley beyond the window, that I do not know how to send you home. I have seen tears in the world's fabric before. The fall of Numenor remade the very shape of this earth, in an age before even my long memory properly began. But nothing in any lore my house holds describes a power like the one you named the Void, nor a road back to wherever it has cut you off from. That is not a comfort I can offer falsely, however much I wish I could. The frame was quiet a moment, and Elrond, watching closely, saw something settle in its posture. Not despair, but a kind of resigned, steady acceptance, the look of someone who had, in truth, expected exactly this answer, and had already begun, somewhere in the long solitary road north, to make peace with it. I appreciate you not pretending otherwise, the frame said finally. Everyone else who's wanted something from me has been quick to promise things they couldn't actually deliver. You not doing that is worth more than you probably realize. I have watched too many promises made in desperation curdle into betrayal, across too many ages, to make one I cannot keep, Elrond said. But I will offer you this, which is smaller and truer, my house's protection, for as long as you wish it, and my counsel, freely given, on the shape of the war that has found this world, regardless of whether you ask to be part of it. Sauron's shadow lengthens with every season, stranger, and I do not believe, from all you have told me, and all Faramir's account confirmed, that his attention has moved past you simply because you refused Denethor's hall. The Nine do not forget what they have marked, and Sauron does not forget what the Nine report to him. So I've traded one steward's leash for a Dark Lord's patience, the frame said, something dry and tired threading through the flat voice. You have traded nothing, Elrond said, and there was a quiet firmness in it that Mablung, had he been present, would have recognized as the same steady conviction that had carried this house safely through 3 ages of a world's slow unraveling. You have simply learned, faster than most who fall unbidden into this world's wars, that neutrality is rarely a choice this world's shadow allows to stand unchallenged forever. That is not a cage closing around you. It is simply the truth of the age you have landed in, and what you choose to do with that truth remains, as it always has, entirely your own. Outside the window, the last color drained from the sky above the valley, and somewhere far below, the house of Elrond's evening songs began to rise faint and clear over the sound of falling water, and the frame, listening, found itself, for the first time in 3 long weeks, sitting somewhere that felt, if not quite like home, then at least like a place worth staying long enough to learn. The frame stayed in Rivendell through the turning of a season, weeks that Elrond's house measured differently than the anxious, war-bled calendars of Gondor, weeks spent in a valley where the operator, for the first time since the tear had closed, felt something in themself begin, cautiously, to unclench. There was work to be done, even in sanctuary. Elrond's scholars, quiet, patient elves who had spent centuries cataloging lore most of Middle-earth had long forgotten existed, pored over accounts of the fall of Numenor, of the breaking and remaking of the world's shape in ages past, searching for any thread that might connect what they knew of that ancient catastrophe to the stranger tear that had thrown a void-born weapon into their world. They found nothing conclusive, but in the searching, the frame found something it hadn't expected to find at all, a kind of quiet camaraderie, sitting long evenings in candlelit libraries beside elves who asked careful, genuinely curious questions about the void and the Oricon and the strange architecture of a war fought across stars none of them had ever seen, and listened to the answers with none of Denethor's hunger, none of the wary calculation the operator had learned, across a lifetime, to expect from anyone powerful enough to want something from them. It was Glorfindel, in the end, who first raised the sharper edge of the question everyone in the valley had been circling without quite naming. "You cannot stay in this valley forever," the ancient elf lord said one evening, finding the frame alone on a terrace overlooking the falls, where it had taken, in recent weeks, to standing in the quiet dark, long after the house's halls had gone silent for the night. "Not because you are unwelcome. You are not, and Elrond has made that plainer than I have seen him make it for any stranger in longer than even I can easily recall, but because the shadow that marked you at dawn over the Pelennor has not forgotten you simply because you vanished into these mountains, and a war is coming that will not, in the end, leave any corner of this world untouched by its reach. Rivendell's peace is old and deep, but it is not infinite, and it was never meant to be a place where strength hides from the world rather than choosing how to meet it." "I know," the frame said quietly, watching moonlight scatter silver across the falling water below. "I've known since the day I left Minas Tirith. I just wanted—" It paused, searching for words that didn't come easily even now, weeks into a stay that had done more to steady the operator's fractured nerves than anything since the tear had first thrown them here. "I wanted to understand what I was choosing before I chose it. Denethor wanted a weapon before I'd even had the chance to decide what I wanted to be in this world. I didn't want to make the opposite mistake, choosing a side before I understood what the choosing actually meant, or what it would cost." "And do you understand it now?" Glorfindel asked. The frame was quiet a long moment, and inside its narrow chest, the operator turned the question over with the same slow, careful weight they'd been carrying it for weeks, through long library evenings, through quiet conversations with Elrond that ranged from the shape of the void to the shape of grief, through nights standing alone on this terrace listening to water fall and trying to feel out, beneath all the careful strategy and caution that had kept them alive across a lifetime of other people's wars, what they actually wanted, when no steward's demand and no empire's expectations stood over their shoulder shaping the answer for them. "I think I do," the frame said finally. "I've spent my whole life being made into things other people needed, a weapon for the Oricon to point at their enemies, then a weapon the Tenno turned against the Oricon instead, then whatever the war after that needed me to be next. Every single time, someone else decided what I was for, before I got the chance to decide it myself." A pause, and something in the flat voice had steadied, settled, in a way Glorfindel hadn't heard from it before. "This is the first time in longer than I can remember that nobody's trying to hand me that answer, and I think that's exactly why I have to be the one to choose it now, instead of waiting for someone wiser, or safer to choose it for me? And what have you chosen? Glorfindel asked, quiet and unhurried, the question of someone who already suspected the answer and wanted, all the same, to hear it spoken plainly. I'm not going to fight for Gondor because a steward commanded it, the frame said. And I'm not going to fight for Sauron because he's patient and terrifying, and clearly wants something from me he hasn't shown his hand on yet. But I watched Faramir choose kindness toward a stranger who owed him nothing, when cruelty would have cost him nothing either. I watched Mablung choose patience over an arrow, in the dark, when patience was the harder and more dangerous choice. That's not nothing. That's not Gondor's crown or Gondor's war. That's just people, choosing to be decent when the easier path ran the other way. A long pause, the frame's faceless helm tilting toward the moonlit valley below. I think that's worth defending. Not because anyone commanded me to, because I choose to. Glorfindel was silent a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was something almost warm beneath his ancient, measured voice. That is, I think, very close to the only answer in this whole long, weary age of the world that has ever been worth trusting completely. He turned to go, then paused at the terrace's edge, looking back. Elrond will want to hear this from you himself, when you're ready to say it aloud to more than the dark and the water. And I suspect when you do, this house's protection will become rather more than shelter. It will become alliance, freely offered, freely chosen, on both sides. That is not a small thing, stranger, in an age that has forgotten too often that such things could still exist between very different peoples. The frame found Elrond the following morning, in the same quiet chamber where their first conversation had unfolded weeks before, and spoke the choice aloud, not as a declaration of loyalty to Gondor's crown or Rivendell's council, but as something simpler and, in its own way, more binding. A choice to stand, when the war finally came for this world in full, on the side of the people who had shown it, first and consistently, that decency could survive, even in a world built on the long, grinding weight of an unwinnable feeling war. Elrond listened, and when the frame finished, he was quiet a long moment. Ancient eyes distant with some calculation Faramir would have recognized instantly as the same careful weighing Denethor had brought to his own hall weeks before, though where Denethor's calculation had reached, hungrily, for command, Elrond settled, instead, into something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. Then let us speak plainly of what comes next, Elrond said, because I do not believe, from everything you have told me, and everything Faramir's account first carried to my house, that Sauron's patience with watching from a distance will last a great deal longer. The Nine marked you at dawn over the Pelennor. His eye does not linger on anything so long without eventual purpose. Whatever peace this valley has given you to make your choice, stranger, I fear the world beyond these mountains is not going to give either of us much longer to prepare for what that choice will cost. Outside the window, autumn light lay gold and clean across the valley, and far beyond the mountains ringing it, in a black tower rising over a land of ash, something vast and patient and utterly unhurried had, in the weeks since a shadow's report first reached it, finally begun, quietly, deliberately, to move. The word reached Barad-dûr on a cold morning 3 days after the Witch-king's report, carried not by any messenger, but through the deep, patient currents of will that bound the Nine and lesser servants alike to the tower's dark heart, a confirmation, gathered slowly and carefully, across weeks of watching, that the strange power which had fallen into Ithilien had gone to ground in Rivendell, and had, in the time since, begun speaking with Elrond's house in tones that sounded, to ears attuned across 3 ages to the shape of forming alliances, uncomfortably like the early stages of one. Sauron received the report in the black silence of his innermost chamber, and felt something that might, in a being who had long ago traded away most ordinary feeling for power, have been the ancient, cold cousin of frustration. It has chosen a side, he thought, turning the confirmation over with the same patient, exhaustive care he brought to every piece of the vast, slow game he had been playing across this world for 3 ages. Not my side, not even, fully, Gondor's, but Elrond's, which in practice amounts to nearly the same defiance. He had hoped, in the quiet weeks since the terror had first rippled across his awareness, that patience would yield what threat and command had already failed to produce in Denethor's clumsy hands. That the stranger, isolated and lost in a world it did not understand, might in time drift toward the only power capable of offering it a place that asked nothing so soft, or so slow, as Rivendell's counsel. That hope, he understood now, watching the confirmation settle into certainty, had been misplaced. Very well, he thought, and there was something in the thought that carried, even now, a kind of terrible patience, undiminished by the setback. If it will not be claimed, it will be measured instead, its true strength weighed properly, at last, rather than guessed at through fragments and reports. And when the full weight of what is coming finally reaches Rivendell's gates, we will learn together, stranger, whether Elrond's counsel and your own strange convictions are worth what they will cost you. He turned his attention outward then, toward the vast machinery of war he had spent years assembling in patient, grinding secrecy across Mordor's ash-choked plains, the armies mustering beyond counting in the Black Land's deep valleys, the Haradrim gathering under their own banners in the far south, the Easterlings moving in long dark columns toward staging grounds that had, until recently, existed only in careful, unhurried planning. The war he had been building toward for years did not need to change its shape for the sake of one unexpected stranger, however strange its power. But its timing, he decided, watching the vast, patient machinery of his own dominion turn slowly toward readiness, might yet be adjusted to make the fullest possible use of the lesson this new power was about to learn, about the true scale of what Middle-earth's free peoples believed themselves capable of withstanding. In Rivendell, the weeks that followed the Frame's declaration passed in a different rhythm than the anxious weeks before it, no longer the careful, watchful holding pattern of a stranger deciding whether to trust or be trusted, but the steadier, more purposeful work of a valley preparing, quietly and without panic, for a storm its oldest council had felt gathering for longer than most of its younger inhabitants fully understood. Elrond called a council, smaller than the great gatherings his house was known for in the oldest songs, but weighty all the same, drawing together Glorfindel, a handful of his most trusted scholars and captains, and the Frame itself, seated now, not as a curiosity to be assessed, but as a voice with a place at the table, to speak plainly of what preparation the coming war would actually require. Sauron will not move against Rivendell directly, Elrond said, laying out a worn map of the western lands across the council table. Not while Gondor still stands between his armies and the wider world, and not while the ring he seeks remains unaccounted for by any report his spies have yet returned to him. But he will move against Gondor, and soon, if the pattern of these past weeks holds, and when he does, every free power in this world will be measured by how it answers that hour, whether it wished to be measured or not. Then that's where I need to be, the Frame said, and there was no hesitation in it now. Weeks of careful, private weighing having settled, finally, into something as steady and unshakable as the mountains ringing this valley, not because Denethor commands it, because Faramir and Mablung showed me what this world is actually worth defending, before I understood anything else about it, and I'm not going to let a steward's pride be the reason I forget that lesson when it matters most. Gondor's walls are strong, Glorfindel said, but 2 years of grinding war have worn them thinner than any of us would wish, and Denethor's pride has cost the city allies it could ill afford to lose. Even before your arrival, complicated matters further. If you mean to stand with Gondor when the full weight of Mordor's armies finally comes, you should know plainly what you are choosing. Not a clean fight against a clear enemy, but a defense of a city whose own lord may yet resent the very strength that saves it, simply because that strength never bent fully to his command. I've fought for worse reasons than that, the frame said, and something dry and steady had crept into the flat voice, the ghost of the same tired humor it had first shown Moblung in a dark clearing weeks and a lifetime ago. I'm not fighting for Denethor's gratitude. I'm fighting because I've seen enough of what this world could become, if it falls, to know I'd rather stand somewhere useful than stay safe in a valley while it happens without me. Elrond studied the frame for a long moment across the worn map, and something in his ancient, weathered face settled into quiet, unmistakable approval. Then let us plan properly for what standing there will require, he said, because I do not believe, from everything the Shadow's movements these past weeks have suggested, that Sauron intends to give Gondor, or you, a great deal more time to prepare before he tests exactly how much all of this careful choosing is truly worth. Outside the council chamber's tall windows, the last gold light of a long autumn afternoon fell across Rivendell's silver falls, and far to the east, beyond mountains and rivers and the long, weary miles of a world that did not yet know how close its own reckoning had drawn, Mordor's armies continued their vast, patient gathering, a storm that had begun, weeks before, as nothing more than a single tear in a quiet forest sky, and had grown, in the time since, into something that would not, when it finally broke, leave any corner of this age of the world untouched. Far south of Mordor's ash-choked plains, in a war camp sprawled along the banks of the Harnan River, a Haradrim captain named Suhail ambled through rows of dark tents in the gray hour before dawn, checking the readiness of men who had marched 3 weeks from their southern homeland, at a summons they had not questioned, because questioning the Dark Tower's summons was not a habit that kept a man's family fed in the harsh, sun-scoured provinces south of the Great Desert. Suhail did not hate Gondor, whatever the war's simpler tellings might assume of every man who marched beneath Sauron's banners. He had never seen the White City's walls, had no quarrel with a people he'd never met, and carried into this war the same complicated, unglamorous calculus that had carried his father into Sauron's service before him, and would, in all likelihood, carry his own sons into it after. Tribute owed, old debts from a war 2 generations gone that his people had lost badly enough to still be paying for, and the plain, hard fact that refusal carried a cost his village could not survive paying. "You're quiet tonight, Captain," said Zahir, a younger officer walking the row beside him, checking mustered spearmen against a tally scrawled on worn parchment. "More than usual. There's word moving through the camp," Suhail said. "Word of something that fell out of the sky weeks past, in the north. A power that fought 9 of our own scouts and let every one of them live." He shook his head slowly. "The men are calling it an omen. I don't know if I disagree with them. An omen of what? That's the trouble," Suhail said. "I don't know. Might be an omen this war finally turns against the tower for once. Might be an omen of something far worse than anything we've marched against before." He paused at the edge of the camp, looking north toward mountains he couldn't see yet, toward a war he had never chosen and would, within weeks, be asked to bleed for regardless. "Either way, I've learned not to put much faith in omens, only in what's in front of a man's spear when the fighting actually starts." Zahir was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, careful in the particular way of a man testing ground he wasn't certain was safe to walk. "Do you ever wonder, Captain, what it would be like, not fighting this war, not because we chose the tower's cause, but because refusing it was never truly a choice at all?" Suhail's eyes didn't leave the dark northern horizon. "Every day," he said quietly. "But wondering doesn't feed my daughters, Zahir. And it doesn't unmake 3 generations of tribute owed to a power that doesn't forgive debts easily. We march because the alternative is worse, not because the cause is ours. He turned back toward the tents, and something tired and resigned settled across his weathered face. Get some rest. Word says we move north within the week. Whatever fell from that northern sky. The tower doesn't wait on omens to decide its own timing, and neither, in the end, can we. He walked on through the sleeping camp, and above him, the last stars faded slowly from a sky already beginning, in the deep secret councils of a dark tower's patient planning, to gather toward the storm that would carry Suhail and Zahir, and 10,000 men like them north, into a war that had never truly been their own to choose. A small, human thread in a vast gathering tapestry of armies that cared little, in the end, for the complicated grief of the men who marched beneath its banners. In Rivendell, the frame spent its final weeks of preparation not in council chambers but in the training yards below the valley's main halls, working alongside Glorfindel and a handful of elven warriors to understand, properly, the particular shape of the war it had chosen to stand inside. Your enemy's greatest weapon isn't strength, Glorfindel told it, one gray morning, as they sparred with blunted blades across packed earth still damp with dew. It's despair. The 9 do not need to strike a killing blow, if they can first strike the will to resist one. I have watched brave men's knees buckle beneath a Nazgul's shadow before a single weapon was drawn against them, not from any wound, but from the sheer, crushing weight of a fear that unmakes courage from the inside. That doesn't work on me, the frame said, parrying a strike with the flat of its energy blade, the 2 weapons ringing bright and clean in the cool morning air. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's the void. Maybe it's just that I've already had worse things than fear try to break me, and none of them managed it either. That may prove your greatest strength in the battles to come, Glorfindel said, stepping back. And it may also prove a danger you have not yet reckoned with fully. Men who stand beside something immune to fear sometimes forget that they themselves are not, and lean too heavily on a strength that cannot, in the end, carry their own courage for them. You will need to remember, when the real war comes, that the soldiers fighting beside you are not built the way you are, and that your task is not only to strike down what threatens them, but to be the steady thing that lets their own courage hold. The frame was quiet a moment, weighing this, and something in its posture shifted. Not doubt, but the particular thoughtful stillness of someone absorbing a lesson it recognized, distantly, from another life entirely. I used to fight alongside other Tenno, it said finally. People who trusted each other because we'd all survived the same thing that made us. I don't have that here. Whoever I fight beside in Gondor won't understand what I am. Not really. Not the way another Tenno would. No, Glorfindel agreed. But understanding is not the only foundation trust can be built upon. Faramir did not understand what you were, that first night in Ithilien, and chose patience regardless. Moblung did not understand it either, and chose the same. Trust built on shared danger and proven choice can hold as firm, in the end, as trust built on shared origin, sometimes firmer, because it has been tested honestly rather than simply assumed. He raised his blade again, settling back into a ready stance. Now, again, Sauron's armies will not pause to let you finish learning this lesson gently, and I would rather you learn it fully here, in this yard, than half learned on a battlefield where the cost of the gap runs higher than a bruised pride. They sparred on through the cool morning, blade meeting blade in bright, ringing arcs across the training yard's packed earth, and far beyond the valley's sheltering mountains, in a war camp on the Harnon's banks, and a black tower rising over ash, the vast, patient machinery of a gathering war continued its slow, inexorable turn toward the moment when all of it, the frame's hard-won choice, Suhail's unwilling march, Denethor's wounded pride, and Sauron's long, cold patience would finally converge on the white walls of a city that had no real understanding yet of how close its own reckoning had drawn. The word came to Rivendell on a cold morning in early winter, carried by a rider so exhausted he nearly fell from his horse at the valley's edge. Before Elrond's own household caught him, Osgiliath had fallen. Mordor's armies had crossed the Anduin in force, driving Gondor's garrison back across the river in bloody, desperate retreat, and Minas Tirith itself now stood besieged, its outer defenses crumbling under a weight of assault the city's depleted ranks had not been prepared to withstand. Elrond called the council within the hour, and the Frame stood at the table this time not as a guest weighing a choice, but as a soldier receiving orders it had already, weeks before, chosen to accept. "Denethor's pride has cost the city dearly," Glorfindel said grimly, tracing the rider's account across the worn map. "But pride is not what breaks a siege. Numbers are what break a siege. And Gondor's numbers have been bled thin by 2 years of war fought largely alone. If the city falls, nothing stands between Sauron's armies and the whole of the free world west of the mountains." "How long do we have?" the Frame asked. "Days," Elrond said. "Perhaps less. I am sending what strength this house can spare. It will not be enough alone, but every blade added to that wall buys time for whatever else the free peoples can yet muster. Rohan has been summoned. Whether they come in time, none can say." He looked at the Frame directly. "You do not have to ride with us. You chose to stand for Gondor freely, weeks ago, in a moment far quieter than this one. I would not think less of you for choosing, now that the cost has grown steeper than the choosing first accounted for." "The cost was always going to be this," the Frame said. "I knew that the day I made the choice. I'm not backing out of it now because the bill finally came due." They rode within the hour, Glorfindel at the head of a company of Rivendell's finest, the Frame moving alongside them with the same tireless, silent pace that had first carried it out of Ithilien months before. And behind them, Elrond's own voice, carrying one last instruction before the company vanished down the mountain road. "Whatever you find at those walls, remember what this valley taught you about the difference between strength given freely and strength commanded. Gondor will need both before this siege is done, but only one of them will still be standing, true and unbroken, when the fighting finally ends." They reached the Pelennor on the 3rd day of hard riding, and the sight that greeted them from the last ridge above the fields stole the breath from every rider in the company. Minas Tirith's outer walls broken in a dozen places, black smoke rising from burning siege engines and burning city districts alike, and across the whole vast field between the ruins of the outer wall and the river beyond. An army beyond easy counting, orcs in their tens of thousands, siege towers crawling forward like vast dark insects, and above it all, wheeling against a sky gone sick and yellow with Mordor's own unnatural dark, the Nazgul on their winged mounts, spreading despair before them like a physical weight pressing down on every living thing beneath their shadow. "That's," the Frame's voice trailed off, taking in the full scale of it, "a battlefield larger and more desperate than anything even a lifetime of war across the stars had fully prepared the operator to witness. That is what Sauron's patience has been building toward," Glorfindel said grimly, drawing his sword. "Now you understand fully what your choice, months ago, actually committed you to." "I understand," the Frame said, and energy was already gathering bright and steady along its blade. The same calm, focused readiness that had first disarmed 9 Southron scouts in a dark Ithilien clearing, now settling over something built to answer a battlefield of a scale that clearing could never have hinted at. "Let's go." They rode down onto the Pelennor together, into a battle that had already, in the hours before their arrival, ground Gondor's outer defenders down toward the last of their strength, and the Frame, breaking from the company's formation as they crossed into the thick of the fighting, moved through the chaos with a speed and precision that turned heads on both sides of the battlefield, orc lines shattering wherever the pale, blade-bright figure cut through them, siege engines toppling under strikes that no mortal weapon should have been able to land so cleanly against fortified war machines built to withstand far greater assaults. It was mid-battle, cutting a path toward a knot of Gondor's soldiers pinned against the ruins of the outer wall by a press of orcs too thick for their thinning ranks to hold, that the frame first heard Faramir's voice, hoarse, desperate, rallying men who had little left to be rallied with, and turned toward it without hesitation, energy blade carving a bright, clean line through the press of enemies between them. Faramir, bleeding from a shallow wound along his temple, turned at the sound of orc lines breaking behind him, and found the pale, familiar figure cutting through the chaos toward his position, and something in his exhausted, desperate face broke open into raw, disbelieving relief. "You came," he said, as the frame reached his position and turned, immediately, to face the press of enemies still bearing down on the pinned soldiers. "I told you I would," the frame said. "Now let's get your men out of this." They fought together through the worst of the afternoon's chaos, the frame's speed and precision buying the breathing room Faramir's exhausted company needed to fall back toward more defensible ground, and word of it spread through Gondor's ranks faster than any single soldier could have carried it alone. "The stranger has come. The pale warrior fights beside us." A small, bright thread of hope stitched hastily into a battle that had, until that moment, felt to nearly everyone fighting it like a long, grinding slide toward inevitable defeat. But above the battlefield's chaos, wheeling high against the sick yellow sky, the Witch-king of Angmar had already marked the frame's return, had watched, with cold, patient interest, exactly how much strength the stranger truly commanded now that it fought in open war, rather than a single dark clearing months before, and began, unhurried and utterly without fear, to descend. The Witch-king came down out of the yellow sky like a falling shadow given purpose, his winged mount's scream cutting through the battle's roar with a sound that made even hardened soldiers on both sides flinch and stumble, and the ground where he landed, 20 paces from where the frame stood over Faramir's rallying company, seemed to go cold and still, in a way that had nothing to do with any ordinary winter chill. "So," the voice that rolled out from beneath the Witch-king's dark hood carried a weight that pressed against the mind like a physical hand, ancient and hollow, and utterly without mercy. "The wandering weapon has finally shown its true face. My master wondered how long you would hide behind mountains and counsel before remembering what you actually are." "I haven't been hiding," the frame said, energy blade rising into a ready stance, steady and unafraid, in a way that made several nearby Gondor soldiers stare in open, disbelieving awe, for they had watched braver men than themselves crumble to their knees at a fraction of this same dread pressure, and this pale stranger stood untouched by it entirely. "I've been choosing. There's a difference, and you're about to learn it the hard way." The Witch-king struck first, a blade of black, corroded steel sweeping down in an arc that should have, by every law of this world's warfare, ended the exchange before it truly began, and the frame met it, blade to blade, in a collision that rang out across the battlefield like a thunderclap, sending both combatants staggering back a step, evenly matched in that first terrible instant, in a way neither had fully expected. "Interesting," the Witch-king said, and there was, for the first time, something almost like genuine surprise threading through that hollow, ancient voice. "You have no idea," the frame answered, and pressed the attack. What followed was unlike anything the battlefield around them had yet witnessed. Not the grinding, exhausted clash of mortal soldiers against orc lines, but something faster, sharper, a duel fought at a speed that blurred to most watching eyes into little more than flashes of dark steel and pale light. The Witch-king fought with 9 ages of accumulated malice and skill, every strike aimed to unmake not just flesh but will itself, the crushing weight of his presence bearing down on the frame with every exchange, and found, again and again, that weight sliding off something that simply did not carry the fear it was built to exploit. "Your despair doesn't work on me," the frame said, catching a strike on its blade and turning it aside with a precision that sent a visible ripple of unease through the Witch-king's otherwise unshakable bearing. "I've already survived worse things than you, trying to break my mind. You're just going to have to beat me the honest way." It was Faramir, watching from 20 paces off with his sword still drawn and his exhausted company rallying around him, who first noticed the shift in the duel's rhythm. The frame's strikes growing faster, more confident, driving the Witch-king backward step by step across ground that had, moments before, belonged entirely to Mordor's greatest servant. The frame's blade found an opening in the Witch-king's dark armor, a strike that should have, by every mortal measure, ended a lesser foe outright, and the Witch-king staggered, his dark form flickering at the edges like something losing its grip on solid shape, a scream tearing loose from beneath his hood that carried none of its earlier cold command, only raw, furious pain. "This isn't over," the Witch-king snarled, already wheeling his mount back toward the sky, wounded and furious, and for the first time in longer than any living soul on that field could remember, genuinely retreating from a fight rather than commanding it. "You've bought this city a reprieve, nothing more." He rose back into the yellow sky and did not return, and across the battlefield below, a ragged, disbelieving cheer began to rise from Gondor's exhausted ranks, the sight of the Witch-king of Angmar driven back, wounded, by a single figure standing alone, spreading through the fighting lines faster than any horn call could have carried it, and turning, in the space of minutes, the whole desperate shape of the battle's morale. It was not, in the end, a single duel that broke the siege. Rohan's horns sounded across the Pelennor within the hour, riders sweeping down from the north into Mordor's flank with a force that finally, fully, turned the battle's tide, and the fighting raged on through the rest of that long, terrible day, before Sauron's shattered armies finally broke and scattered back toward the river and the mountains beyond. But the frame's stand against the Witch-king became, in the tellings that spread through Gondor's ranks in the days after, the moment the battle's despair had first cracked. The instant soldiers who had believed themselves already lost found, instead, a reason to believe the wall might yet hold. Faramir found the frame afterward, in the exhausted, smoke-choked quiet of the battle's aftermath, standing alone amid the wreckage of the outer wall with its energy blade finally, fully dimmed. "You saved this city," Faramir said quietly. "Whatever my father believed he could command from you, this was worth infinitely more, freely given. I told you, back in Rivendell," the frame said, "I wasn't fighting for your father's gratitude. I was fighting for what you and Mablung showed me this world was actually worth." A pause, weary, and, for the first time in a long while, genuinely at peace. "I still don't know if I'll ever find a way home, but I know, now, what I choose to be, while I look for it. That's worth more than I expected it to be, when I first fell out of that sky." In the weeks that followed, Minas Tirith slowly rebuilt what the siege had broken, and word of the pale stranger who had stood against the Witch-king and lived spread across every corner of the free world that still stood. A story already, in its retelling, beginning to blur at the edges into something closer to legend than plain fact, the way all such stories eventually did in a world that had always understood the weight of a tale worth remembering. The frame did not stay in Minas Tirith. It returned, in time, to Rivendell, to the quiet valley that had first taught it what this strange world was worth choosing, and continued, in the seasons after, the slow, patient search for any thread that might one day lead back to the void it had lost, a search that Elrond's scholars pursued alongside it, without promise, without certainty, but without giving up either. The war was not over. Sauron's shadow, wounded but far from broken, would gather itself again before the ring's own fate was finally decided, in fires far to the east. But something had shifted. In the weeks since a tear first opened over a quiet Ithilien wood, a stranger who had been made into a weapon by one world had chosen, freely and fully, what kind of thing to become in another, and in the choosing, had given Middle-earth something it had not expected to need, proof that even a power built by war and grief could still, in the end, choose to stand for something gentler than the war that made it. And somewhere in a quiet valley beneath ancient mountains, as autumn light fell gold across silver falls, a small, tired self, who had once been only a weapon, sat finally, cautiously, at peace. Not home, not yet, perhaps not ever, but no longer merely lost either. Simply, at last, someone choosing, day by day, exactly who they meant to be.